Hi, my name is Nicholas Farrelly. This is Thailand in Crisis, a series of 6 vodcasts and podcasts brought to you from the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific in Canberra. Over the next 6 weeks, I'm going to be joined by a number of my academic colleagues. We'll be bringing you our thoughts on what's been going on in Thailand and what the future might hold. You can join us in this conversation by adding comments at the ANU's YouTube channel or by dropping in at our New Mandala website. Please feel free to get involved and to send us your thoughts on any topics that you'd like to see discussed. It's terrific that you've stopped by to watch our first episode, and I hope you'll stay involved. Today I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Walker, who is a Senior Fellow in the Department of Political and Social Change in the ANU's College of Asia and the Pacific. Andrew, thanks very much for joining us.
No problem.
Over recent weeks, Thailand has seen a great deal of bloodshed and turmoil. A few dozen people have been killed, a great deal of national upset has occurred, and it's really been a terrible time for Thailand, for Thais, and for everybody who cares about the country. Andrew, can you give us any sense of where you think this situation will head in the weeks ahead?
Well, right now I think it's looking quite disturbing. I think in the immediate aftermath of the breakup of the red shirt protest in Bangkok, we saw a very vigorous outpouring of anger on the part of some of the red shirts, with major shopping centre in Bangkok burnt down and other cases of arson within Bangkok, and provincial offices burnt down in northeastern Thailand. It seems that initial outburst of anger has calmed down somewhat, so we have to wait and see what sort of tactics the red shirts, and especially some of the more hardline elements within the red shirts, may be adopting over the next days, weeks and months. I certainly think there's a likelihood of more protest activity, perhaps some disruption in the provinces and perhaps even in Bangkok itself. More generally, I think the country is struggling with this idea of reconciliation. The government of Prime Minister Abhisit has talked a lot about national reconciliation, but the way they're approaching it doesn't really bode that well for the future. It seems their approach to reconciliation is very much to continue the high-profile vilification of the red shirts, and certainly some of the hardline red shirts in their actions of last week have given them some good material to pursue this vilification. But there doesn't seem to be a real commitment to the idea of respecting different political viewpoints and finding a way forward to bring those different viewpoints together. The other very provocative act of the government is to charge former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra with terrorism. I think most observers accept that there's not much basis to this charge. It seems an incredibly provocative step. If they did succeed in bringing Thaksin back to Thailand and putting him on trial for terrorism, it would generate a huge amount of political anger and very likely future protest activity. So some of the government's actions don't really seem to be signalling such a deep-seated commitment to national reconciliation.
I'd like to turn, if it's possible, to an issue of perhaps longer-term importance. And this is an issue that I know you've already written a bit about. The issue is inequality in Thai society. In your judgment, is Thai society a particularly unequal one?
Well, certainly Thailand is a very unequal society, and it's considerably more unequal than a lot of its neighbours within the region. But to explore this issue, we need to take a couple of steps back and dissect it a bit. Over the last 5 or 6 decades, Thailand has experienced enormous economic growth, some of the fastest economic growth in the world. And the effect of this economic growth has been profound and profoundly positive in many respects. We've seen poverty, including poverty in rural areas, plummet from 80 or 90% of the people 4 or 5 decades ago to about 10% now. We've seen infant mortality rates plummet We've seen rates of literacy and healthcare and all these basic indicators of human welfare dramatically increase in Thailand, including in rural areas. So rural people in Thailand are now much wealthier than they were 5 or 6 decades ago. In fact, I like to refer to them as middle-income peasants. We often talk about the rural poor in Thailand, and there certainly are some poor, but compared to how they were 4 or 5 decades ago, they're now in a much more stable financial position. But at the same time as this general living standard has improved, we've had a very significant increase in inequality. So what does this mean? Basically it means that even though rural people's livelihoods have improved, people in urban areas have experienced improvements in their livelihoods that are much greater. So we've seen a widening income gap in Thailand between urban and rural areas. And in particular, that income gap is marked between people who work in agriculture and people who work in much more productive sectors of the economy, like manufacturing industry. So the cause of Thailand's current political instability is not absolute poverty. It's not really about people coming out and saying we're too poor, we don't have enough food to eat, we can't send our kids to school. The cause of the conflict in Thailand is this relative poverty, the fact that people are improving but they're seeing other people's living standards in the country improve much faster, and that builds up frustrations. People feel that their aspirations are blocked. Yes, they're improving, yes, they're getting involved in new forms of economic activity, but they're still not managing to catch up with what's going on in the cities. And in fact, that living standard in the city seems to be getting more and more remote for them all the time. So if we look at some of the data that's been collected, one of the ways people measure inequality is by a statistical measure called a Gini coefficient. And if we look at this graph of the Gini coefficient in Thailand and some of its main regional neighbours, we can see that Thailand is significantly more unequal than those other countries in the region.
Thanks, Andrew. As a fair number of our viewers and listeners would probably already know, you've undertaken quite a bit of field research in villages in northern Thailand. Those are villages where there remains a considerable amount of support for former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra and for the broad red shirt political agenda that has coalesced around him. Could you perhaps give us a sense, based on your understanding of politics in that region, about what kind of political platform the villages that you know would find most enticing?
Let me say a few points about this and a little bit of background. Yes, I've worked in a part of northern Thailand that is seen as Thaksin heartland. It was the heartland for Thaksin's former party, Thai Rak Thai. But we don't want to get the impression that everyone there supports Thaksin, and we don't want to get the impression that those who support Thaksin or support his political allies now support them unconditionally. I was just looking at some election data a few days ago from the 2007 election, and in the village where I've been working, about 50% of people voted for the People Power Party, the new party that was formed after Thai Rak Thai was dissolved. So they got about 50% of the vote. About 25% of the vote went to the Democrats, and the rest of the vote went to other minor parties. So that's a strong performance by Thaksin's political allies, but it's not a dominant performance, and I think that this is an important point to make. I think there's an impression out there sometimes that in these so-called red shirt areas of Thailand there's some dominating political consensus that everyone supports the red shirts, everyone supports Thaksin, and there's no debate or contention or thinking about policy. What I've found working in northern Thailand is there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of difference of opinion, and there's a lot of weighing up of different policy options put by different parties, and that's reflected in that sort of voting figure I just talked about. So that's a bit of background. In terms of what do people want from the government, well, I think we can sum it up in one word, that people want support. once again, if we look back at the historical development of government and its relations with rural areas in Thailand, we see a very strong transition from the position where 40 or 50 years ago the government taxed the rural economy quite heavily through measures such as the rice premium, which extracted a lot of money from the rural economy. But over the last 40 or 50 years, we've seen that reverse to the situation where the government is now subsidising the rural economy, putting money into the rural economy through development projects, through support for crop prices, through building roads and funding hospitals and a whole range of other welfare and development initiatives. So in terms of that long-term historical development, what people want is the government to maintain that support for the rural economy. And Thaksin, when he was in government, tapped into that aspiration very effectively. His populist policies were continuing a long trend in this transformation from taxing the rural economy to subsidising it. But he presented it in a very politically clever way. He made people feel that they had a sense of entitlement to this support, that they had a role to play in managing it, that farmers could actually manage local credit funds, farmers could actually manage local infrastructure projects. So he provided support, and he provided it in a way that promoted a sense of political inclusion. So even though the current government, the Democrat Party government led by Abhisit, has maintained a lot of these Thaksin-era populist policies, I don't think he has the credibility of promoting this notion of political inclusion. And that's the key issue why people remain loyal to Thaksin's political allies in Thailand, because they see that there is that tradition within that party from the Thaksin era of promoting people's inclusion in these processes of local development. And I don't think the Democrat Party has that credibility yet.
Now that those villagers have tasted the fruits of Thaksin-style populism, do you think that it's likely that they'll go back to some of their former political allegiances?
Well, I think political affiliations in Thailand over the next 5, 10 or 20 years will continue to be fluid. But the reality is that the political game has changed fundamentally. Quite apart from people experiencing the benefits of populist policies, there's also the issue that I've mentioned of people now have a clear aspiration and expectation to be involved in the political game. And this, once again, it parallels the economic development in Thailand. We've seen people move away from concentration on agricultural activity to a much broader involvement in the national economy through working in the cities, through working in factories, through working for government and in service sectors. And paralleling that, people are saying, well, if we're involved in the broader economy, we also want to be involved in the broader political process. So I don't think people are necessarily going to stay wedded to Thaksin or Thaksin's political allies or any particular party, but parties within Thailand are going to have to meaningfully pitch to that aspiration in rural areas for economic and political inclusion.
Thanks, Andrew. It's been simply wonderful to hear your thoughts on all of these matters today. That's all we have time for today. Thanks very much for joining us for this first episode of Thailand in Crisis. If you'd like to leave comments, you can do so at the ANU's YouTube channel, or of course you can join in the conversation at New Mandala. We'd be delighted to hear from you. We'll be back on Friday next week with another episode of Thailand in Crisis. Until then, best wishes to all. My name's Nicholas Farrelly, and this is the second episode of the Thailand in Crisis podcast and vodcast series brought to you from the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific in Canberra. Today we're going to be discussing political and military affairs in the aftermath of the recent violence on the streets of Bangkok. I'll be joined by two of my academic colleagues, Professor Des Ball and Dr. Marcus Mietzner, who are both specialists on military affairs in the Southeast Asian region. If you'd like to leave comments for us, please do so at the ANU's YouTube channel, or otherwise you can join in the conversation at the New Mandala website. Our first guest today is Professor Des Ball, a leading expert on Thai security issues and a world-renowned authority on intelligence and defence matters. Des is a professor in the Australian National University's Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. Des Ball, thanks for joining us today. You've spent much time and energy over the past couple of decades studying Thailand's police and military organisations. Can you give us a bit of a sense about how they tend to fit together? And also, could you give us some idea about the general relationship between, say, the Thai military and the Thai police?
The Thai security system is very complex. You have a large number of groups, of which the key elements are the armed forces, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the National Police Force, and various branches and elements of that, and a whole host of other sort of paramilitary elements. And the relationships between those changes from time to time, can be very complex, and even within a particular organisation or a part of an organisation, like the 1st Division of the Army based in Bangkok, you will still get some dissenting elements. In other words, there's no consistency of policy, let alone political perspective, right through any one of these organisations.
The April and May 2010 violence in Bangkok has been attributed to various sides of Thailand's ongoing political conflict. The Thai government and its troops are allegedly responsible for many of the killings. Des, can you give us a bit of an idea about which particular units have been involved?
The main units over those couple of months from mid-March to 20 May on the Army side were essentially either Bangkok-based units or ones near Bangkok, and most specifically the Army's 1st Division, the King's Guard in Bangkok itself, and secondly the 2nd Division, the Queen's Guard, based out to the east of Bangkok. They were the two main Army divisions. You had several police organisations. The Metropolitan Police had overall charge on the police side, but assisting them were elements of the special branch of the police and a couple of different components of the special branch, including those responsible for riot control. And then also, to complete the police picture, you had the Border Patrol Police and some of their airborne special forces units from Hua Hin, Kai Naresuan, who were also in Bangkok at the time.
So were there any obvious units that weren't deployed?
Yes, there were. During the Yellow Shirt protests, for example, a number of Border Patrol Police units were brought in from the northeast, from Surin, from Buriram, from Udon Thani. None of those units were brought in against the Red Shirts, which might signify something about what's thought about their particular loyalties. Border Patrol Police who were brought into Bangkok on this occasion came from Pitsanalok, or from Tak, or from Kanchanaburi, or from Hua Hin in the case of the airborne commando units. On the Army side, on most occasions when there's political troubles in Bangkok that reach the level of military intervention, you'd expect, in addition to the 1st and 2nd Divisions, to see the 9th Division based in Kanchanaburi on Bangkok's western or Burmese flank. And there were no 9th Division troops involved this time. That may well just simply because by marshalling all of the 1st and 2nd Divisions, they had a sufficient number of troops in Bangkok anyway, without having to bring in the 9th Division.
There is speculation that among the red shirt security guards, who are often referred to as the black shirts, that there are some specially trained elements, perhaps drawn from within the Thai national security apparatus itself. Some have described these special elements as the Ronin. Des, can you give us a better idea about who these people might be?
A little bit. Yeah, one part of them I think are fairly easy to identify. Some of the rest remain speculative. The part which is known for certain is that they include substantial numbers of Thai Prime hunter-killer soldiers, rangers, based at Pak Thong Chai near Karat. And you see those guys acting as security guards around all the red shirt encampments and protest sites. At different times have been reported figures of up to as many as 400 to 500 of those rangers from Pak Thong Chai working with the red shirts. Those guys have got a pretty unsavoury reputation. In many instances, they're no more than just thugs for hire. The headquarters of that unit used to be at Pak Thong Chai, and when that headquarters was disbanded, many hundreds of them just were laid off in the Pak Thong Chai area, and you frequently see them in Bangkok acting as security guards, but working for all sorts of bosses. The other element of the Ronin that I'm not quite so sure about are those more expert, more professional people who are involved, for example, in the sniper shooting, the shooting, for example, that killed Colonel Rom Clow on the 10th of April. I suspect, though I have no firm evidence, that they're from the Special Forces unit at Lopburi, the Special Forces division, Lopburi, just northeast of Bangkok, where they do have those many sniper personnel, some of whom are probably, or undoubtedly, closely related to General Katia Saidang.
Do you have a theory for why self-styled red shirt military commander Saidang was killed?
I think there are two possible reasons, though they're related. One is that he had been party to that ongoing violence between the most militant part of the red shirts, those that included the snipers, for example, on the 10th of April, on the one side, with the elements of the 2nd Division, the Queen's Guard, on the other side. They had been involved in violence going back to the Songkran riots and killings in April of last year. It seems that they were the snipers working for Saidang on the one hand, and elements of the 2nd Division were at the centre of the violence on the 10th of April, when in fact Colonel Rom Clow was shot in the head, and that the killing of Saidang was in a sense part of this reciprocal violence between those two units, the special guys on the red shirt side and some of Rom Clow's mates on the 2nd Division side. The second explanation is that by mid-May, as the security authorities in Bangkok, and particularly the army, are giving consideration to how they're actually going to dislodge the red shirts from Ratchaprasong, one of the issues that they would have had to confront was how to get rid of Saidang and the other more militant leaders who they might have expected would have been putting up a violent resistance, and they had to get rid of them at the outset. So I think one should also be looking at some elements in the army hierarchy which might not necessarily be in the 2nd Division itself, though that's probably where I'd be first looking.
For many years you've remarked on the increasing professionalisation of those Thai military and police officers with whom you're in regular contact. Can you give us a bit of a sense about how they've reacted to the recent events in Bangkok?
Yeah, let me say that I'm not a person who normally supports army crackdowns of protesters. My sort of basic personal philosophy generally starts off from the other side, supporting protesters against army and security crackdowns. But in this case, I think that the security authorities, including both the police and the army, acted by and large very professionally. I'm not sure that I can see what other choices that they had. They had to finally move that red shirt encampment in that central business area of Bangkok. They did it in ways which I think really minimised the violence compared to what it could have been. We could have seen fatalities in the hundreds if it hadn't have been organised properly and conducted properly. I think that within the Thai army, it's still a very bloated army, but there are elements in some areas, such as the Intelligence Directorate, the Operations Directorate, and some geographical areas like the Third Army in the north and northwest, which are among the best in Southeast Asia, in the region. The performance of the Third Army area guys in East Timor, for example, was the best of anyone's in Southeast Asia. The Border Patrol Police are the equivalent of special counter-terrorist units and special operations areas anywhere in the Western world, including the Australian SAS in the case of their Border Patrol Police Special Forces guys. I think that they did a pretty good job as well.
Finally, and much more generally, what in your estimation could be done to try and bring Thailand's police and security forces back into this reconciliation process that Thailand's currently facing? What advice would you give to the Thai government if they asked you about how this system could be reformed?
Well, this period of reconciliation is going to be difficult, there is no doubt about that. It's going to bring up many, many challenges which are going to inevitably involve the security forces. And over that longer term, one would hope that some very radical, very dramatic reforms, reorganisations take place within those security authorities themselves. Much of that depends on the police, which is the one area of general security in Thailand which has the poorest regard among Thai citizens, whether they're in Bangkok or in villages. The level of corruption that exists there, their inability to perform basic police tasks. Reform of the police and professionalisation of the police is, I think, the number one priority. Secondly, with regard to the army itself, it's far too top-heavy and it's far too bloated. You could cut that army in half, give it more mobility, better intelligence, better communications, better firepower, and make it a much more potent force. You could get rid of more than half of the general level officers, and you could get rid of conscription, which is an unnecessary burden on the army now, more than an actual benefit to the army. And you have this myriad of paramilitary groups in Thailand which support one or other of the other security authorities and frequently compete with each other and indeed sometimes actually fight with each other. in the south. I'm sure that many of the killings in the last half decade or so have been members of one of these groups killing other members, killing members of other groups, often not for political reasons at all, but for economic reasons, involvement in criminal and other illegal activities, etc. I would get rid of them totally over the years and end up just with a reformed police force for internal security, a very much transformed Army, Navy and Air Force for external security, and the Border Patrol Police taking over all of the functions of those paramilitary groups responsible for border security, and have a rationalised structure of just those three organisations.
Thanks, Des. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Nick.
Our next guest is Dr. Marcus Mietzner, lecturer in Indonesian Studies in the ANU's College of Asia and the Pacific. Marcus, great that you could join us today.
Thanks for having me.
You've been studying Indonesian politics and the Indonesian military for well over a decade now. When you look at the Indonesian experience over those 10 years and you compare it to the Thai experience over the same 10 years, what trends become apparent?
I think what really becomes apparent is how important coherence and unity in the civilian elite is, and that is what Indonesia had in terms of their attitude towards the military. And that's what's obviously lacking in Thailand. In Indonesia, in 2002, the political elite decided on a framework, on a political framework for the polity, through constitutional amendments that sidelined the military. And because the coherence within the elite was so strong, there was nothing the military could do about that. So they simply had to accept sort of playing now a second role, a secondary role in Indonesian politics, because the Indonesian elite wouldn't allow anything else. Now in Thailand, obviously, that coherence, that cohesion is lacking. There's a high level of fragmentation in the elite that you don't have in Indonesia at this point of time.
How have the Indonesian police and military responded to the profound changes in Indonesian society during the post-Suharto period? Has the military, in fact, responded well to the new democratic system which is in place?
Well, the military has really now focused on defense. In the past, there was a strong internal security role for the military. That has now been phased out. The police, on the other hand, has been taking over that internal security role, and most importantly, in the last 5 to 6, 7 years, a counter-terrorism role. That is something that the military actually would like to have, but the police is firmly in charge. So again, it all comes back to what kind of role the political elite actually allows the military to play, and at the moment the political elite has decided that that role is external defense. Now, would the Indonesian military like to come back into internal security, into a more political role? Yes, it would, but so far it has not been given the chance to do so.
In Thailand, there's a lingering sense that further military interventions into politics and even military coups are almost inevitable. Is that the case in Indonesia?
At the moment, it's very unlikely that we will see a military coup anytime soon. But yet again, you know, with Thailand, it was the same thing. In 1992, there was the last coup, and then we've seen relative stability in Thailand for 15 years, and then suddenly the coup in 2006. So I wouldn't rule it completely out for Indonesia. The infrastructure for military intervention remains in place, and that is the territorial command structure, which very uniquely places the Indonesian military at every level of civilian governance. Now again, as long as the civilian polity is strong, democracy remains accepted in Indonesia. The military finds it very, very difficult to find an entry point to stage a political comeback. But should there be an economic crisis, a political crisis, a crisis of confidence in the Indonesian democracy in the way that we see now happening in Thailand, it's perfectly possible. Again, very unlikely at this point, but possible in the long term.
Finally, Marcus, are there any specific lessons from the Indonesian experience that bear extra consideration in the Thai context?
I think two issues are important here, and again coming back to the importance of elite cohesion when it comes to formulating a stance towards the military. The Indonesian elite has understood very clearly that if they do not show that cohesion, the military will stage a comeback. Whenever there's fragmentation in the elite, the military comes back. Now, this is what Thai politicians obviously don't understand. I mean, they use the military in order to fight their political rivals. The military in Thailand is an instrument for civilian elites rather than something that needs to be marginalized from the democratic polity. The second lesson here is that it is very important to have a dispersed power landscape in order to create good conditions for civilian democratic control of the military. That means, in concrete terms, when Suharto left the scene, the very and single dominant figure in Indonesian politics was gone. Power fragmented across the landscape. There was now more power in the regions, in the parliament, in the government institutions. It was no longer concentrated in one hand. Now, if you draw the parallels to Thailand, I think the role of the king here is very unique, and it is, in terms of civil-military relations, a destabilizing factor, because he has one factor that holds authority quite undemocratically in terms of deciding, which coup is legitimate, which one is not, which government is legitimate, which one is not. So very similar to the role that Suharto had in New Order Indonesia. That role, that single dominating role in Indonesia is now gone, and one would hope that in Thailand something similar happens in the near future.
Thanks, Marcus. Wonderful to have you involved today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today, and a very special thank you to our guests, Professor Des Ball and Dr. Marcus Mietzner. It was simply terrific to hear what they had to say on Thailand in crisis. Of course, you can leave comments for us at the Australian National University's YouTube channel, or you can stop by at Umandala, where we really look forward to continuing this conversation. Next week, in the third episode of the Thailand in Crisis series, I'm going to be joined by another two of my academic colleagues. They'll be Dr. Tyrrell Habercorn and Professor Hilary Charlesworth. They'll both be discussing human rights, violence and international law in the aftermath of Thailand's recent political strife. I hope you can join us then, but in the meantime, best wishes to all. Series brought to you from the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific in Canberra. Today I'm going to be joined by Professor Hilary Charlesworth and Dr. Tyrrell Habercorn, who will be discussing with us their thoughts on violence, human rights and international law in the context of the recent strife on the streets of Bangkok. Then I'll be joined by my regular guest, Dr. Andrew Walker, who'll be offering some insights about agriculture and development in the rural north of Thailand. As ever, if you'd like to leave questions or comments for us, you can do so at the ANU's YouTube channel, or, of course, you can join in the ongoing conversation at Umandala. Thank you for joining us today. Our first guest today is Dr. Tyrrell Habercorn, a research fellow in the ANU's Department of Political and Social Change. Tyrrell is an expert on political violence, human rights and a range of other matters. She's joined us today to give us her take on the recent crackdown on the streets of Bangkok. Tyrrell, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
I know that you watch events in Thailand particularly closely. As a scholar of political violence and everything that goes with it, what was your initial reaction to the crackdown that we recently saw in Bangkok?
One of incredible concern, both for the people who were killed, the people who were detained, but also for the long-term political and historical events. And as time has passed since the crackdown, and the question of what kind of investigation will take place, who will complete that investigation, what will happen to those results, I've grown increasingly more concerned. My concern is that if the roles of, particularly of state actors in the crackdown and not following their own outlined rules of engagement are not made public, then it will further entrench a culture of impunity, not only for state violence, but violence in a broader sense in Thailand.
Much of your research deals with questions of political violence in Thailand, particularly in the northern parts of the country. Can you tell us about some of the histories of that violence, and in particular what it was like in northern Thailand in the 1970s? How violent was it back then?
Quite violent. While most of the existing work in both Thai and English on the period of the 1970s, particularly the period between the 14 October 1973 movement and the 6 October 1976 massacre and coup, in addition to the period of repression which followed after the coup, has been focused on Bangkok and what happened to students throughout the rest of the country, in the north, in the northeast, in the south. Many people experienced repression. In the mid-1970s, particularly in 1975, a series of very prominent farmer activists were assassinated in a series of assassinations which remain unsolved to this day, and which most people who I know think will remain unsolved forever. Their killers won't ever be named. Perhaps of most relevance to the present moment, and in particular to what seems to be a growing wave of arbitrary detention of anybody seen as dissident. After the 6 October 1976 massacre, there were mass arrests throughout the country, not only of at least 3,000 people who were arrested in Bangkok who had been at or near Thammasat University, but also over the next 3 years, thousands of people, an as yet unknown number, were arrested as quote-unquote dangers to society under an executive order. And many were arrested in the north, in the northeast, and in the south, under varying conditions of detention and for varying periods.
What lessons can be drawn from that history?
I think there are a couple. One of them is that arbitrary detention is bad. But this was actually an insight that the government itself recognized in 1979 when they annulled the executive order authorizing arbitrary detention. As I noted, the order was to detain people who were deemed a quote-unquote danger to society. That was actually the legal category with which people were identified. That order was in force until August of 1979. And in the law nullifying that order, a note was appended saying that the arbitrary detention of people deemed a danger to society was in fact a danger to society itself. Of broader concern, one of the unanswered questions about that period and those detentions, which is very relevant in the present moment, is that we don't know how many people were detained. The Department of Corrections in 1976 said it was approximately 2,000 people. Human rights advocates believed it was much higher. Even the US Library of Congress in a report said it was approximately 12,000. And after 1979, a prominent general noted in an interview with Sayamrat newspaper that arrest lists were approximately 60,000. That's a huge range. And I think not knowing and not having that documentation is very damaging.
On to more contemporary matters now. You've been studying Thailand for over a decade. How would you characterise the human rights situation during that period?
I think it's remained grave throughout that period in different ways. One of the things that I think is very important to note, particularly given accusations that those who criticize the current crackdown must be supporters of Thaksin, is that my own perspective is that human rights were terrible under Thaksin, they're terrible in the present moment. And I think for people concerned about rights, at least for me, like that's the bottom line. If people are being killed, if people are being arbitrarily detained, I don't care who's doing it. It's of danger to Thai society in a broader sense. And I think keeping that in mind is very, very critical for people on all sides of this conflict and from all perspectives.
Just how bad could it get?
I think it could get incredibly terrible, where we see a constriction across the board in Thai society, where we see increasing constriction on freedom of speech, which we've all watched build over the last 3 to 4 years. You can see increasing extrajudicial killings of those deemed a danger to the state or those deemed dissident. And then we could see an increasing sense of impunity for not only state actors committing those crimes, but I think what I'm most concerned about is that if the state begins to act with impunity against citizens, it will send the signal to other elite actors that it's possible to do so as well. And in that sense, it references what happened during the Thaksin period, in which 18 human rights defenders were assassinated, in some cases that have been prosecuted and some that have not, by, let's say, collaborations between state and private capital. And my concern is that what will happen in the present will be a combination of all of this.
The red shirt movement is still, to one extent or another, intimately linked to former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra and his political machine. Of course, when the former Prime Minister was actually in power, he wasn't really much of a friend to Thailand's human rights advocates. How does a human rights advocate position fit with the current red shirt political agenda?
I think the most crucial piece of that question is remembering how heterogeneous the red shirt movement is. And actually, in the present moment, I think what's significant is not only the red shirt movement itself, but those who have come out to say that whoever the red shirts are, it's not okay for them to be killed simply because of the color of the shirt they wear. And where I see human rights as being connected to the red shirt platform is that I think whether or not various sectors of the red shirt platform are pro-human rights, and as you know, Thaksin himself is certainly not a friend of human rights, not only with assassinations of human rights defenders, but also the Kuruse and Takbai massacres, which happened under Thaksin, the declaration of martial law and emergency rule in southern Thailand, under which there have been tremendous violations of human rights. But I think if I was going to give a piece of advice to the red shirt leadership, whoever they may be, it would be that they need to think about human rights at this moment, both in order to gain legitimacy as a movement, but also in order to challenge what seem to be some of the most dangerous threads in current Thai politics.
Tyrrell, you keep a pretty close eye on what happens to Thais who are accused and convicted of breaking Thailand's lèse majesté laws, which are there to protect the royal institution. Of course, many people out there will be aware of the cases of Harry Nicolaides and Jonathan Head and others, but there are many Thais who tend to fall through the cracks and who, when accused of these crimes, don't tend to get much attention. Can you give us a sense of what's happened on that front since the crackdown of May 2010?
There are two responses that I'd like to offer. The first is to note that since the crackdown on May 31st, 2010, Jiranut Premchaipon had her first hearing in the criminal court in Bangkok. She's the editor of Pracha Thai newspaper, who is accused of not removing comments deemed to be anti-monarchy quickly enough from her website. She's facing up to 50 years in prison, not under Article 112 of the Criminal Code, which is the lèse majesté law, but under the Computer Crimes Act of 2007, under which other people have been tried, sometimes in combination with Article 112, for alleged crimes of insulting the monarchy. The next hearings in her case will be in February of 2011, but I think that's one very, very concerning case in the moment. In a broader sense, I think that the rash of detentions of those seen to be affiliated with the red shirt movement or dissident in some way, while people aren't being held under Article 112 per se, must be seen in that same context. And the reason is that between the mid-April violence and the mid-May violence, the Center for the Resolution of the Emergency Situation, or the SAHCHA, released what we now know to be their map of a plot an alleged plot to topple the monarchy. Not only have individuals named on that plot been detained, but I think that's part of the broader context of the crackdown.
Do you have any suggestions for how the Thai government or the international community could help resolve the current political strife in Thailand? Do you see any end in sight?
I don't see an end in sight anytime soon. In the short term, I think there will be increased repression of freedom of speech, increased constriction of dissidents, and an increased atmosphere of fear. In the long term, I'm very concerned that facts and evidence about what has actually happened over the last 2 months, what actions state actors have taken, will not be made visible, will not be made public. In terms of suggestions for how to resolve this current crisis, to the Thai government, the first thing I would say is stop censoring the press, stop shutting down websites, stop observing what citizens are doing online. It's creating an atmosphere of fear. It's obstructing the free circulation of information, and it's a very dangerous move. Number two, make public the names, numbers, and places of detention of those who have been arrested since mid-April, not only in Bangkok, but also in the other areas of the country under emergency rule. Number three, the Apisit government has said that they will launch a fully independent investigation of what happened. I think this is a wonderful statement. I think what exactly independent means is something that will need to be made very clear. In terms of the international community, I think people need to keep watching what's happening in Thailand and remember that the land of smiles is anything but that, not only in the present moment, but I would actually argue historically as well.
Tyrrell, thanks very much for coming and sharing your insights with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick.
Our next guest is Professor Hilary Charlesworth, the Director of the School of Regulation, Justice and Diplomacy. Hilary, thanks very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Many people watching today's vodcast probably aren't aware, Hilary, that you were instrumental in bringing a Human Rights Act to the Australian Capital Territory, where our university is located. Beyond that, you're a very prominent advocate for a human rights-centred approach to law. Can you tell us about why you think this is important work to do?
I think the critical aspect of a human rights approach to law, to governance generally, is that it moves these issues simply beyond the will of the majority or the will of the most powerful. The essence of a human rights approach is to say power can be exercised subject to some constraints, and these constraints are as set out in the various international human rights treaties. So it means, for example, we've had human rights issues certainly here in Australia, and the argument in Australia would be, well, our government currently operates simply who's in power is indicated by who wins most votes. But if you layer on top of that a human rights approach, you're saying you can't ride roughshod, for example, over the rights of minorities. These have to be taken into account. This is an element of good governance. So it's moving majoritarian government to a truly democratic government.
Turning to Thailand now, during the recent crisis, the Thai authorities declared what were called live fire zones in some of the central areas of Bangkok. Can you think of other examples where governments around the world have so suspended their usual norms?
I think that the Thai government's justification for this is the emergency, the situation of emergency, and they have then said live fire is possible under certain circumstances. Seems to me this is a very worrying development and certainly goes against all rules of international human rights law. There are, of course, unfortunately, there are other examples of governments who declare live fire will be possible in particular circumstances. It's happened in Burma, it's happened in Zimbabwe at different cases, but they've always been highly criticised as quite contrary to human rights law. While human rights law does acknowledge the possibility of having emergencies and suspending some laws, it's absolutely clear that one of the basic principles of human rights law, which is the right to life, can never be suspended. I see that the live fire zones have been very much criticised, particularly by the UN Special Rapporteur on summary and arbitrary executions, Philip Alston, who's criticised the Thai government over the past few years. He's twice asked for the Thai government to allow him to visit Thailand to investigate some of these issues, but his letters have never been answered by the Thai government.
One of the talking points among those of us who study Thai political affairs is the country's lèse majesté law, which protects against insults to the monarchy. It's still enforced with a fair degree of vigour in Thailand these days. Can you give us a bit of a sense about how that kind of law stacks up against the sedition provisions or other laws against insults to revered institutions that other countries might have?
Well, from a human rights perspective, first of all, the principle is freedom of speech. So there's a prima facie problem with a law that prohibits certain sort of talk. But of course, there are laws of quite acceptable laws for libel and against defamation, etc. How do the Thai laws fit into this? The striking thing is a number of countries have similar laws, as it were, on the books, but they're very, very rarely used. And the essence of an appropriate prosecution for offences seems to be if one is actually advocating the death or overthrow of a particular institution. So the way that these laws appear to have been implemented in Thailand gives questions for concern. I note that a couple of years ago the Thai king himself said that he didn't think that he was immune to criticism, and in fact that he welcomed criticism. And from my observation, a number of the cases where charges have been laid have simply been what we certainly here in Australia would regard as normal or garden-style criticism of political leaders. So in that sense, I think that the use of the lèse-majesté rules are of considerable concern in a country, and I would think certainly violate the right to freedom of speech under the Civil and Political Covenant to which Thailand is a party.
There is often talk, but really of a bombastic kind, that Thailand requires international legal intervention now, maybe even some kind of war crimes tribunal to sort out the country's troubles once and for all. At least to my untrained mind, that all seems profoundly unlikely. But could you give us a bit of a sense, Hilary, about what international law or foreign governments perhaps can offer to a country in Thailand's current predicament?
I want to note, first of all, that Thailand, interestingly, rare among Asian countries, has signed, it hasn't yet ratified, the Rome Statute for an International Criminal Court. If it did become a party to the International Criminal Court, these type of issues could conceivably, if they weren't dealt with adequately domestically, be taken to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So Thailand is, as it were, halfway there. I suspect that it's not likely to ratify the Rome Statute. There are, of course, as you indicate, there is the possibility, it usually has to be with the host country's consent, to establish a special criminal tribunal such as we see in Sierra Leone today and so on. There are a number of these examples around the world. I suspect that these tribunals would have limited value in the context of Thailand. Perhaps one of the things that might offer some possibility for constructive outside pressure is the fact that Thailand has recently been elected to the UN Human Rights Council. It was elected just in May this year as a member of the Human Rights Council in quite a toughly fought election. Now, there was quite a lot of international criticism of the Thai election and also at the same time Libya's election. Countries and non-government organisations saying, well, this is a bit worrying. These two countries with significant human rights problems have been elected to the Council. I noticed that the Thai government immediately issued a press release saying that their election to the Human Rights Council was a sign of the faith of the international community in their human rights record, which is, one would think, a very optimistic view of the actual evidence. However, I do think that now being a member of the Human Rights Council, that may be, because Thailand will have to turn up, it will have to be engaged in major discussions on human rights issues. Seems to me that may be a constructive forum for some pressure to bear. However, the signs are not particularly positive in the sense that Thailand has really cut itself off from a large part of the international human rights community, for example, by refusing to allow a number of special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council to visit it. My hope is that now it itself is a member of the Council, it will be much more difficult for it to resist the request for a mechanism of that very council of which it's a member to visit Thailand and to make itself equally open to the scrutiny, perhaps criticism, of these international mechanisms.
Hilary Charlesworth, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Nick.
Today I'm joined once again by Dr. Andrew Walker, a Senior Fellow in the Department of Political and Social Change, which is part of the ANU's College of Asia and the Pacific. Andrew is going to be talking about some of the issues that have been raised since episode 1 of Thailand in Crisis. Andrew, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Nick.
We've really enjoyed getting all of the feedback on the previous episodes of Thailand in Crisis. It's really wonderful to hear all of the opinions that are out there about Thailand's current period of political strife. We've got one question that we're inclined to deal with in a bit of detail today, and this is one that Andrew Walker's going to turn his hand to answering. The question came from a reader who dropped by the ANU's YouTube channel. They wanted to know about Thaksin's populist policies, and those of course included a national health program, handing out 1 million baht to each village to use as they wished, and debt relief as well. The present government policies consist of propping up the price of rice, this viewer told us. They also asked, what policies should the government follow that will have the most benefit for the poor in the long term without alienating them in the short term? We think this is a fantastic question. Andrew, what do you reckon?
So in good academic style, Nick, I want to answer that question indirectly. I want to look at a couple of policy areas, one related to education and one related to rural economic development. And I want to look at some data that I've put together, firstly based on information contained within the UNDP's Human Development Report for 2009. And one of the issues they focus on in the report is the issue of education. And if you look at this first graph, it's a summary of how Thailand has performed against what they call various human achievement indicators. And the full details of that are available in the report. And you can see that Thailand has performed pretty well against most of these human achievement indicators. It's performed very well compared to a lot of other countries of a similar socio-economic standing as Thailand. But you can see from this summary graph that there's one area where Thailand has performed less well, and that is education. So you can see in the shape of that graph there's a bit of a dip in the area that corresponds to the Human Achievement Index relating to education. And that poor performance in relation to education becomes very stark if we move to a second graph that examines the situation specifically in relation to northeast Thailand. And we can see here that there's a particularly poor performance in relation to education in that region. And that goes to the issue that I talked about in the very first version of Thailand in Crisis a couple of weeks ago, when I was talking about the fundamental problem of inequality in Thailand. And if we look at this map that's been prepared by the UNDP as part of their Human Development Report, we see a very stark illustration of that inequality in relation to education. The red zones, and it's no surprise that they are the red zones, are those where the education performance in Thailand is relatively poor. The green zones are those areas where the education performance in Thailand is relatively good. Now, there's a whole series of indicators behind these different colours, and people can look at those in the UNDP report. But just let me give one example in terms of the average number of years children attend school. In Bangkok, it's around 10 years. In the north, and especially in the northeast, the average ranges between about 6 or 7 years. So we have children on average in these rural areas of Thailand attending school for 3 less years than their counterparts in urban Bangkok. Now, this obviously has implications for a whole range of issues related to inequality in Thailand. In particular, it means that people with less schooling have less access to more lucrative areas of employment within the economy. So we find that in rural parts of Thailand we have a large percentage of the workforce working in the informal sector, where employment is less secure and wages are lower. So this is obviously an important contributing factor to Thailand's inequality, which is directly related to differential standards of education between the rural areas and Bangkok itself. So one of the challenges for the Thai government is clearly to address this inequality in education. The inequality is clear, it's stark, but it's also addressable. It's not so bad that it couldn't be dealt with by appropriate government action. And certainly the current government is making some efforts in this area. In the draft budget for 2011 that was put to the Parliament a week or so ago, we saw a very significant increase in education funding being provided. And this is partly to support the government's initiative to provide free or very low-cost school education throughout the country. So that's an important policy initiative by the current government. What the political impact of that initiative will be remains to be seen. Now, the second policy area I want to talk about today, Nick, is the issue of rural economic development. And here I've got some different data and much more specific data. And this comes from the area where I'm actually doing ethnographic fieldwork in northern Thailand, which is a rural municipality in the north. And a few weeks ago, going through some old folders in my office, I was lucky enough to come across some very old industrial survey data. And this actually includes a survey of the rural municipality where I'm working from about 1970. And it shows the structure of commercial employment in that municipality. And you can see that summarised in this graph. And you can see here that there's a reasonable balance between the retail sector and shop owning, restaurants, things like that, the typical retail activity you see in the rural economy, and the manufacturing sector. There's about an equal level of employment in both of those sectors. But if we jump to the present, to a much more recent industrial survey undertaken by the Thai government, we'll see a very significant change. And as you can see in this second graph, the retail sector is still very important. It's expanded, and this is evident in any rural area you go to in Thailand. As incomes have increased, we've had a proliferation in that rural retail sector. But there's also one other striking thing about this second graph. Employment in the manufacturing sector has collapsed, and it now makes up a very modest part of this local rural economy. Now, in this particular case, there's one very obvious reason why this has happened. In the 1970s, there was a large tobacco processing factory in the local district centre, and this closed in the early 1970s, and it was a very significant employer. And we don't have anything like that in the local rural economy at present. And I think what this is a symptom of is a process of, in a sense, de-industrialisation in many rural areas in Thailand. We've certainly had a great deal of modernisation and commercialisation, but often the private sector, in particular the manufacturing sector, is very sparse on the ground in these rural areas. We've seen a lot of primary industry processing factories closed. We've seen, in particular, a decline in the timber processing industry in rural Thailand since the national logging ban of the late 1980s. And other private forms of activity, other commercial economic activity, hasn't grown up to take its place. So this has got two important policy implications, I think. First of all, the government hasn't been particularly successful in encouraging that private capital accumulation, that private sector economic activity within the rural economy. Under Thaksin and previous governments, we saw a lot of emphasis on relatively tokenistic schemes like OTOP, the One Tambon, One Product scheme, but they pretty much focused on relatively low value, relatively niche handicraft products. They didn't really promote what we might call rural industrialisation. The other key implication of this is, in the absence of the private sector in the rural economy, the economy becomes very dependent on the public sector, on government funding for projects, for infrastructure, for service provision, for public sector employment itself. And that's one of the reasons why rural people in Thailand care so much about the political process. Because the government essentially underwrites a lot of the rural economy, it's really important for rural people that they have a say in how that government is selected, managed, and what sorts of rural development policies are put into place. So that's a bit of a long way of giving a brief answer to the second part of the question I'm addressing here, and that is that another key policy challenge for government in Thailand is to address this issue of rural industrialisation, so the rural economy can become more diverse and generate a wider range of employment opportunities that can provide higher value employment for rural people.
Andrew, thanks very much for joining us once again today.
It's a pleasure, and I'll be back next week with another graph.
Looking forward to it already.
Okay, thanks Nick.
Thank you very much for joining us today. A big thank you to our guests, Tyrrell, Hilary, and of course Andrew. We have something really special planned for next week, so I really recommend that you stop by and check out episode 4 of Thailand in Crisis. It promises to be a beauty. And in the meantime, don't forget that you can leave comments and questions for us at the ANU's YouTube channel, and you can continue to join in the conversation at New Mandala. Until next week, best wishes to all. Of the Thailand in Crisis vodcast and podcast series brought to you from the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific in Canberra. Today we're going to be talking about history and political protests in Thailand. Who better to bring in on this kind of conversation than Professor Thongchai Winichakul from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He's going to be joining us over a Skype connection. Here in Canberra, I'll also be joined by my regular Dr. Andrew Walker, who'll be talking about agriculture and national budgets in the Thai case. I know he's got a few interesting things to share. As ever, if you'd like to leave comments for us, you can do so at the ANU's YouTube channel, or you can join in the conversation at New Mandala. Our first guest today really needs no introduction. He is Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Thongchai Winichakul. Professor Thongchai Winichakul, thank you very much for joining us all the way from Madison, Wisconsin.
Thanks for having me on your program.
Thongchai, many of our viewers and listeners will already be aware that you're one of Thailand's most prominent historians. So of course it makes sense to begin today's interview with a little bit of history. Some of our viewers and listeners won't, however, be aware that in the 1970s, you were, well before you were a historian, a prominent Thai student leader. In the protests of 1976, you were active, and then, of course, you were locked up in government detention for 2 years after those protests. Can you perhaps tell us a little bit more about your experiences during that time? What are your memories of those difficult years? And more specifically, can you tell us a bit about what it was like to be locked up in government detention? I imagine that it was a very emotional and even a very difficult time.
If we talk about those 2 years in jail, it was harsh. It was difficult in the early months. But overall, it's not as difficult or as bad as people might imagine. There were times in the first few weeks that it was very scary. Like there's one night, the police took each of us, the so-called ringleaders of the student movement. They took us in a kind of a 2 or 3 emergency police convoy, and take each of us into separate places. It was scary, so I thought that was it, the final, but no. Once we get to the morning, they just brought us back together in the same cell again. So even up to now, I don't know what happened that night. Otherwise, the hardship was not as bad. Of course, I mean, locked up for 2 years is bad enough, but in terms of such as physical things, a few punches, a few times, but mostly it's about unhealthy, filthy, crowded cells. There was one time that very small cell, like a 3 by 4 meters, and including the toilet inside, 8 of us in the same room. So at night it's like fish in a can. We just have to be careful when we sleep, not to, hurt other people. But, or living without a son for a year and bad food. But looking back, I was only 19 years old at the time. So although the tragedy was bad enough, I mean, very heavy in my mind, but the radical spirit, the feeling like willing to fight on, the anger for revenge, and I think include very important is the hope for a successful revenge, the hope that a revolution will come. All of this led to a kind of fantasy that okay, one day revolution will take place, Congress will open the prison door and let us out. And to have such a fantasy in jail and at that young age, it turns out it was not a bad thing. So it's like a psychological drug to postpone the reality. The sense of, guilt or heavy burden, terrible sadness, hopelessness, that kind of thing. Hopelessness, I mean, and by later years I realized that I'm part of it. I can't just say that, blame everybody else. We are part of it. But let's say the true understanding of the suffering many people went through, families of people who lost, and even including my own parents. I mean, those kind of true understanding didn't sink in until the fantasy was gone. So after many more friends die in jungles for nothing. So I think it was those years that the loss on the October 6th, the killing that I saw, the fear, screams, cries, anger that's still in my memory. I mean, the suffering that my parents went through. It's later years that those things began to sink. Even though those later years I was already out from jail. So I don't know, I'm not sure, being a political prisoner in jail at that young age with the fantasy, or the later years when I grew up, when I'm a bit older and when our fantasy is gone. I'm not sure which one is more difficult.
As a historian, you have often written and talked about issues of memory. These are issues, of course, that are of interest to any historian, but in the Thai case there are particular stories to be told about the collective memory of the events of October 1976. Do you, beyond any reflections that you might have about those matters, see any parallels between that period and what we have all just witnessed in 2010?
We usually assume that the first-hand individual memories are like different pieces of jigsaw, and then when we put together, it would form a total picture, or the total picture of what happened. No, that's not how a collective memory is established. A collective memory is never the total sum of individual memories. And in case of massacre memories, I found the interesting thing is that the master narrative emerged pretty quickly, a few hours after the killing. The master narrative that is a memory that individual memories can take part. I mean, can claim to attach, can claim to be part of the big. For example, the triumphant or the heroic memory of the right wing at the time, established quickly a few hours after the killing. Then many right wing people have their stories. Oh, I was there, I saw this, I did that, to be part of the larger right wing collective memory. Whether or not those people saw that, did that, not sure. Like I read the 200 or 300 testimonies of these people giving to the police during the 3 months after the massacre. It's so clear that many of them did not witness what they said that they witnessed. There are some details that is possible. Some people make it explicit that they know that, or they can tell the story, this and that happened, even though they were not there, which means where they get the story. they get from the collective memory somewhere else, on TV, newspapers, or from friends. And then they can put their own experience, put their own individual memories to be part of that. So a collective memory is not the total sum of the individual ones. It's the opposite. I think it's established early, and then individual memories can claim to be part of it, or can share some elements of the collective memory. So the curious thing is how and when the master narrative for each collective memory was established. I think that is tricky. It has nothing, well, I shouldn't say nothing, but it has little to do with truth. It has little to do with fact, in the sense that collective memory must be true, collective memory must be factual based. No, not true. Collective memory is all ideological, biased, partisan, and always political. Facts that fit it survive. Facts that don't fit it would be forgotten, or at least was suppressed.
Turning more fully now to those events of April and May 2010, can you give us some sense about what your initial reaction was, perhaps in terms of what your initial master narrative of these recent events has been?
My initial reaction, sad. I don't know how to explain, just sad, very sad. Frustration that I can watch it on the internet. Can't do anything. Killing again. It may sound a bit of bragging, but I believe that I could sense a feeling of people at Ratchapasom. I could be wrong, but I remember that initially. It's not the same as being there. I didn't have the same anger and fear as I was in 76. I think because physically I was not there, but it's a weird feeling. It's a weird feeling that sad, can't do anything, and just think. And it happened it's about midday in Bangkok. It's about 1 o'clock something here, so it's quiet. Suddenly everything turned quiet. Yeah. How the collective memory of again, as I say, I think the collective memory for the May 2010 crackdown is I believe that it's already emerged, but let's say for me to see it, to realize that it becomes collective memory. It's not that it hasn't emerged yet. I think it has already, but it may take me a while to realize which one, or the authority, or the power of which story or which account. It might take a while for me to realize, and I'm not sure that the contestation is still very strong. That's how I can say how I feel. Yeah.
Who or what do you think is to blame for the recent crisis that we've seen playing out on the streets of Bangkok?
If we have to put a blame, I think so many mistakes by so many people, but yet they are not as serious as the government. The blame should go to the government. Very simple. I have an example for the mistakes or let's say something wrong that I think we have to put in perspective. Again, part of the problem, the blame, is that it depends on the story that each people have. Depends on the story, and it depends on perspective. It depends on when we started when we start the story, when we end the story, what's the meaning of the story, and then the blame should go for whom and to what extent. For example, the government blamed the UDD leaders. Many of them, based on their speeches, based on what they said at the demonstration. The government and some other people quoted the leaders, they said this, they said that, the hate speech. Or let's say, remember when they blamed that, oh, Thaksin said this, it means that Thaksin prepared the terrorist movement. Oh, the leader, I'm not sure, Dr. Wood or Dr. Paul said that about the burning, about the, if the soldiers come, we can be frightened and then go into the store. That means those are the planned arsons. I think those are exaggerated interpretations. If we take those words literally, well, in 76 we talk about blood in exchange for blood. We talk about taking arms. We talk about this and that. At the end, we didn't have arms. We didn't have weapons. So we have to be careful about putting blames, not exaggerating it, and then put it in perspective. The bottom line, in my opinion, we should stand firm. We should stand firm on the. I would say this is how I see it. The belief or on the view that the Red who want equal democratic rights, who want to end the injustice of double standards, those are not crimes. Those are not crimes. The protesters, the Red people may cross the lines and made several mistakes, but fundamentally they were not committing. They did not committing crimes. They challenged the establishment. The bottom line is that Thailand and people who in Thailand, the people who challenge the establishment are usually considered worse than a criminal. That is wrong. So their mistakes should be put in perspective. On the other hand, the government now, almost like impunity. Nobody talk about, not many people now are talking, not many people now are talking about the government wrongdoing, the crime that the government has committed.
You've already mentioned that you are often frustrated when you're so far away from events in Thailand, in distant Wisconsin. I assume that on many occasions you miss Thailand a great deal. Can you give us a sense from your perspective of how you see analysing Thailand from such a great distance?
People in Thailand often say that, then I don't know enough. I never argue because I don't think it's worth to argue I know enough or not enough. I believe that I know and I understand as much and as little, as good and as bad as people in Thailand with different backgrounds, with different analytical skills, and in different positions. The more frustration is, maybe to me, because I can't deny that to some extent my past still haunts me. I mean, being activist, sometimes when just watching and can't do anything, it's just, yeah, that's frustrating. Like I just mentioned a moment ago, just watch. Okay, they're talking. Oh, the gunshot, and then they decide to give themselves into the police, and then suddenly the voice from Ratchaprasong just gone, silent. I still can see the picture of empty stage for many more minutes on that day. It's really weird. It's really strange, and that kind of frustration. But on the other hand, what distance helped me? Yes, I never claimed that distance helped me understand things better than people inside Thailand either. No, I don't claim that because it's not true. Distance gives us different perspective, give a different sense of urgency, which sometimes is good, sometimes is not good. Distance is very, I think, is very important for a situation like the polarization in Thailand in the past some months or years, because distance helps me help people like you, like me, help us who are far away avoid being dragged into or being consumed too much by the intense polarization. We take side, yes, we take side, but I believe that people like us who are far away, when we take side, it's not the same thing as people in Thailand taking side. They are much more consumed and dragged into the polarization than we are. It is hard for people in Thailand to have a distance, and they really need a distance. I think this is the virtue of having distance for people like us.
I was in London in 2006 when you gave a particularly interesting talk about those you consider the kingmakers of Thai history. At other times I'm aware that you've even referred to something of a premiocracy in Thailand in honour of the current Privy Council chairman. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about how you see these kingmakers fitting into Thailand's current politics as it's playing out right now.
I know that the jurisdiction of the lese majesty law doesn't cover Madison or Canberra. but let me talk about history. Put it this way. At almost every transition from one reign to another during the Chakri dynasty, almost everyone, there was some explicit turmoil in the courts. Even when the transition was smooth between King Rama V to the VI, King Chulalongkorn to King Vajrayana, the turmoil was not obvious, was not explicit at the moment of transition, but it was a delay or disguised turmoil. Very troubling situation, but it didn't happen right away. Unlike some other transition that it took place right away in the court. Between Rama V to the VI, it didn't happen that way. But let's say we count that kind of delay and disguised turmoil, it means that in every case, almost in every case, I can't remember from Rama I to II yet, I think it did. In that case, I think the turmoil took place before. Yeah, that's right. The turmoil took place before the real transition. So in every case, without exception, there were players who tried to exert their influence, who tried to, and who did participate in the decision about the future of the monarchy. So that kind of transition and those people who involved in the process, many of them, factions, camps in the palace circle, these are people who I call the kingmakers in the past. Should I assume that the present is different from the past? Should I assume that in the present there was no kingmakers, there was no faction, there were no camps, there were no people involved in transition? Ask yourself, and then if you find the answer, then those are the people who I call the kingmakers. We might want to think, we might wish to think that under democracy, the monarch is above politics. But I believe that your audience or your readers of New Mandela knows they are not naive anymore. That they know that the notion that the monarch is above politics depends on how you interpret and how you understand it. Anyway, if the monarch is above politics, the transition shouldn't be much a problem because it doesn't involve power. But as we know, we're not naive anymore. So that's why it's a high stake about the transition, and with that high stake, that's why whatever the kingmakers do or are going to do, it's very important. Do I know who are they and what they do? Well, whether or not I know, it shouldn't be the issue that we can talk. Even the jurisdiction of lese majesty law doesn't cover Canberra, but I think the police can listen to our talk too. So let's not talking about it.
I know that this is a particularly tough question to try and answer, but if you were asked to try and sum up the achievements and the failures of Thailand's current king, how would you start?
Okay, Nick, how dare you talk about the failures of the current king?
Next question then.
You definitely don't know enough about Thailand. No. Okay. I will start with kind of three conditional questions. mean, I don't expect answer, but let's say this whatever people would say about how would they sum up the achievement or failure of the current king, I think there are at least 3 questions or 3 factors involved before they can say that. One is that, do you want hagiography or do you want critical history? 2 is that achievement and failures in what term, to whom, for whom or to whom. And then the third one that came to me right away is that has the less majesty law been abolished yet? I don't think, I mean, I ask this because, for example, the last one, I don't think a good and balanced assessment of the achievement, I'm talking about achievement, I'm not talking about failure at all. I don't think a balanced, let's say, evaluation of the achievement of the king is possible under the lese majesty law. In fact, I mean, we can say that, oh, the law will prevent people from speaking the whole truth. Yeah, that one we know. But I would say what is also interesting is that the law eventually will hurt the current reign, will hurt the assessment of the current king. Because any highly positive assessment of the current king will be tagged on with a question mark. People would always make a footnote. Is it true? This is all convincing. This is all trustworthy information. His legacy will be in doubt as long as the law exists. Anyway, if I need to assess or sum up the achievement or failure, I'm not sure I can think fast enough. I would say it will be the assessment, whatever assessment will be highly debatable for a long time to come.
Beyond the current crisis, many Thai and foreign observers are currently trying to work out what might happen at the end of the current king's reign, the 9th reign of this Chakri dynasty. Can you perhaps give us some words of guidance on how you think this could pan out?
And to say this, I think I would be in trouble too for lese majesty law. But let's say this is an academic question, so I hope that people respect my freedom to raise this issue, which is: do you think had the king passed away, say before 2006, before the coup, how would we view his current? How would we view the King Bhumibol's reign? How would we view or talk about the legacies of the reign? I believe that it would have been different from what is going to happen, what going to actually happen. I mean, what actually happened is that now the king hasn't died yet, and he will after 2006, after 2010 actually. I believe that now when people talk about the present reign, the present king, it would be so different from, let's say, the if scenario that had he passed away before 2006. Let's put it in another way for the same issue, for the same observation. I believe that the reception and reaction to Paul Halley's book would be so different had the king passed away before the book was published. And what is going to actually happen in the near future. I believe that's one thing. I don't have a kind of clear idea how to, I mean, what you call the guidance, how we do it. But let's say just these observations. These observations just raise questions about the current reign as much as about ourselves, the observers and scholars of Thailand.
Finally, Thongchai, you've been a politically active scholar of Thailand for decades now. I'm wondering, what are your hopes for the future of the country? And in particular, do you have grounds for being optimistic at the moment?
In my opinion, it is sad that I believe that Thailand is heading towards a civilian authoritarianism for some time. I mean, a civilian authoritarianism is needed now to maintain the status quo, which is the democracy with the monarchy. The monarchy is on the upper floor, on the upper level of politics. Civilian authoritarianism, the kind of examples that I can think about now, I mean, to help the audience, to help our audience to understand the term. Think about Marcos. Think about Marcos. He came to power by election, so popular, becoming a cult of Marcos, and the Indian hero, he's a civilian with strong backing from the army, and he ruled with the emergency decree. He ruled with the martial law. He manipulated elections. He even he even changed the constitution to extend his power. Thailand won't be like everything like Marcos, but I mean, just to give you an idea that I'm not sure that it must be pessimism, right? But anyway, that's how I think that Thailand is heading towards that way. The question is whether or not this kind of regime would be able to sustain the status quo that the royalists want. I don't think so. Then the question is, would it help? Would it escalate troubles to both, I mean, that kind of civilian authoritarianism, Marcos-like regime, or not Marcos-like, sorry, maybe too far, because Thailand and Philippines are not very, very similar. There are a lot of differences. The question is that would that kind of regime that I don't have a clear idea yet, but I think it's going to be along that line. Would that kind of regime escalate or cause more trouble to both democracy and the monarchy? I think so. For democracy, of course, authoritarianism caused trouble for democratization. But what the royalists think that this kind of regime, obedient to the monarchies, would be is necessary to maintain the status quo. I think it will hurt them, not in the long future, in the near future. This sounds pessimistic. On the other hand, I think I just take this as change. Change is both good and bad. Serious change are coming. Serious changes have already taken place. Changing in the rural society that Andrew talked about in the episode number 1 and many other things. Nobody can stop these changes. The royalists try to create this kind of civilian authoritarian regime to maintain the status quo. No, they can't. It will change. The question is that how much the cost would be, how much damages would be. I don't have a clear idea yet.
Professor Thongchai Winichagun, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to have you via this Skype connection from Madison, Wisconsin. We really appreciate all of your time. Today we've been talking to Thongchai Winichagun about Thai history and all it entails. I know that Andrew Walker's also been thinking about history recently, and in fact, as I understand it, you've been having a close look at the history of Thailand's national budgets.
That's right, Nick.
Can you tell us, Andrew, a bit about what you've found?
Yes, Nick, I've been looking at the history of the Thai government budget, and in particular spending on agriculture, and I've come up with a couple of pretty interesting graphs. In this first graph you can see the growth in agricultural spending since the 1960s up until a couple of years ago, and you can see that there's been very substantial increase in government spending on agriculture. I've adjusted these figures for inflation, so this graph reflects a real increase in spending on agriculture, and you can see that's very substantial indeed. You can also see a similar pattern of increase from this second graph, which expresses government spending on agriculture as a percentage of the agricultural GDP. So a very similar pattern of long-term growth is evident. So there's a big picture issue here, and that relates to a point I've made a couple of times in previous editions of Thailand in Crisis, that the government has become a very significant player in the rural economy, and this is reflected in these budget figures. And that's a very obvious reason why rural people care about the political process. Their desire for political inclusion has a very obvious economic basis, and that is they want to have a say in how government funding, which is very significant for the rural economy, is spent. So that's the big picture from these graphs. But there's a very interesting smaller picture if we look at the history of the last 10 years. And let's go back to that first graph, but here I've added another little bit of information. I've highlighted one particular era within that graph, and that is, of course, the era of the Thaksin government. And here you can see a very interesting trend that hasn't been commented on a lot. You can see that, in fact, under Thaksin, agricultural spending within the budget was pretty flat. There was a little bit of an increase in the middle of his term, but overall, over his term, that agricultural spending was flat. Now, if we look at the second graph, which expresses government agricultural spending as a percentage of agricultural GDP, we get a very interesting picture indeed. And we can see under Thaksin, in fact, as a percentage of agricultural GDP, agricultural funding for government funding, for agriculture declined very significantly. Now, there's a couple of important points here. First of all, these figures challenge the common perception that Thaksin's electoral popularity was based on him flooding the rural economy with money. Now, of course, there's lots of different ways you can support the rural economy apart from spending on agriculture, and Thaksin did spend money in other areas, but these figures show that the mythology, in a sense, about Thaksin's populism and the amount of money he spent in rural areas needs to be subjected to a bit more scrutiny, and that narrative needs to be given a lot more nuance. The other important point, I think, is that these budget figures point to an issue of political vulnerability for the Thaksin government at that time. And that was, I think, that the government was vulnerable in relation to its agricultural policies. And these spending figures provide one indication of that vulnerability. And this is something I picked up a lot when I've been working in northern Thailand. I found that people often commented very favourably about Thaksin's social, economic development and health policies, but there was often considerable criticism of the government's lack of support specifically for agricultural activities. And this criticism linked up to a couple of other issues. First, there was concern about the possible impacts of free trade agreements on agricultural producers, especially the impact of the free trade agreement with China. And there was also a perception amongst the farmers I was working with that under the Thaksin government, the government was increasingly pushing farmers into the arms of the private sector, in particular through contract farming arrangements. And there was some sense, some discomfort about the idea that the government itself was pulling back from agricultural support and agricultural extension and was relying more and more on the private sector to perform that function. So I think one of the issues that's led up to the current political crisis we're experiencing in Thailand at the moment is that the opposition party at the time, the Democrats, weren't really able to develop a credible policy alternative to Thaksin's agricultural policies. Thaksin was vulnerable in this area, and the Democrat Party wasn't able to capitalise on that vulnerability. As we know, they practically ran to lose in the 2005 election, and they weren't willing to contest the 2006 election at all. And I think this inability of the opposition forces at the time to develop some alternative policies that could counter Thaksin's influence is an important factor to consider if we're looking at the origins of the current political crisis.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That was fascinating as always. It occurs to me, looking at some of those graph lines that you've put together, that some really interesting things happened from the late 1980s onwards. Can you maybe just tell us a bit more about what you think went on there?
Well, a couple of things. That big spurt in growth on agricultural spending took place during Thailand's economic boom. So there was investment in agriculture during that boom. The other point is that a lot of that growth took place under Democrat Party governments and governments of other political complexions. So I think in looking at this longer term history, we can start to put some of the preoccupation with Thaksin's populism in perspective. The things Thaksin did were parts of very long-term trends in Thai's political history.
Wow, it's really fascinating. Thanks very much for coming in, and I'm sure that a lot of the people out there listening and viewing this vodcast and podcast will have enjoyed your graphs as much as I did.
Pleasure, Nick.
Thanks again for coming in. That's all we're going to have time for today. It's been wonderful that you've joined this 4th episode of Thailand in Crisis. We're really looking forward to episode number 5, which will come out at about the same time next week. In the meantime, of course, you can leave your comments for us at the ANU's YouTube channel, or you can join in the conversation at New Mandala. Until next week, best wishes to all. To you from the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific in Canberra. Today I'm going to be joined by some of our most eminent economists. I tell you what, under most circumstances, I find economics pretty dull, pretty dry and pretty hard going on my flimsy grey matter. But I reckon what we've got lined up for you today should shed a bit of light on how economics plays into Thailand's current political troubles. As ever, if you want to join in the conversation, you can do so at the New Mandala website, and of course you can leave comments for us at the ANU's YouTube channel. Thanks very much for joining us again. Our first guest today is Professor Peter Waugh, who, alongside his position as Professor of Agricultural Economics here at the Australian National University, he is also the Executive Director of the National Thai Studies Centre. Peter, it's a great pleasure to have you here today.
Pleasure to be with you, Nick.
So, Peter, as I mentioned, you hold a chair in agricultural economics, and many of our viewers and listeners will already be aware that a great deal of your research has focused on poverty, particularly in Asia. But I'm wondering if, on a more personal note to start with, you might be able to tell us about how you became interested in Thailand and its economy in the first place.
Okay. Well, the answer to that one doesn't have much to do with economics, Nick. I did my graduate study in the United States, and it was all fairly theoretical, and then theoretical economics, and then came back to Australia to teach at Monash University, taught there for 3 years, and then I was lucky enough to be offered a job here at the ANU. And until then I'd never been to Asia at all. I made a short visit to China, and then a bit after that I made a visit to Thailand. And I just became captured by Thailand, its people, its culture. Coincidentally, I had for many years been interested in Buddhism. So being in a Buddhist society had a special appeal to me. There I was at the ANU, and this was 1980, 30 years ago now, and I had the opportunity to work on any Asian country I wanted. So why not the one that seems to be the nicest place to visit? Thailand. I worked on other Asian countries as well: Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Korea. But Thailand has always been special for me. And it's not a coincidence that after several years back and forth to Thailand, I met a Thai lady, and surprise, and we've been married for more than 20 years now, and we have 3 children.
Wow.
So I have a family link to Thailand also, so Thailand owns me.
Peter, what I'm really hoping today is that you can offer us some of your insights about the role that economics has played in Thailand's recent political strife. Is there a simple economics answer to what's been going on?
Yes. I think economics helps us to understand it in part. There's a political story overlaid on top of the economic phenomena that have been driving events over the last couple of decades. The economics is there and it is important. I think there are 3 points that I would want to make, and since I guessed that you were going to ask me this question, I have some charts that illustrate the points I want to make. The first chart is about a long-term increase in economic inequality in Thailand. So on this chart, you see the big thick orange line. That's a measure of inequality called the Gini coefficient. The scale for the Gini coefficient is on the right-hand side of the diagram. The numbers for the Gini coefficient can go from 0 to 1. Higher numbers mean more unequal. The axis, you notice there, goes from 0.3 to 0.7, just to make the just to dramatise the changes that have occurred. And what you see is a big increase in measured economic inequality in Thailand, and the increase all occurred between the early 1980s and the early 1990s. I'll come back to that in a minute, but the other 3 lines on the diagram, the ones that are pointing downwards, are measures of poverty incidence, absolute poverty incidence, and they have all declined. The top one is rural poverty incidence. The bottom one there is urban poverty incidence, the levels are much lower, and the one in between is national level, which is a weighted average of those two. Poverty incidence was coming down from the early 1960s. But at the same time that absolute poverty incidence was declining, inequality increased. So what that means is that the poor were benefiting in economic terms from the economic growth that Thailand was experiencing over this period, and the rate of poverty reduction is closely correlated with the rate of economic growth. However, the rich were doing even better. So the incomes of the rich were increasing even faster. And then the next diagram shows that maybe even more simply. This one is it divides the population into 5 groups called quintiles. There's the poorest 20% of the population, the next poorest, the next poorest, the next poorest, finally the richest 20% of the population. And it asks, what's the share of total national income going to each one of those 5 quintiles? And the chart shows data for 4 points in time. And these data all come from the Thai government. 1975, 1988, 2002, 2006. They look at the poorest quintile group, that's the poorest 20% of the population. Their share of national income declined throughout that whole period. What about the next poorest 20%? Their share declined. The next poorest, same thing. Finally, the 4th quintile, that's the next poorest. Their share of national income declined. Well, how can the share of every group decline? It couldn't. Someone's got to get the increase in share, and there it is in the final part of the diagram. The richest 20% of the population, their share increased. So every other segment of the population received a declining share of national income except the richest 20%. Now there are many other dimensions to this. I'm looking only at income there. It's possible to look at asset ownership. That's another way of measuring inequality. And we had a conference here late last year at which Professor Pasuk Pongpachit did exactly that. She showed measures of asset inequality. Well, I don't have time for that now, but here's another way of getting at the reason for this increase in measured inequality that's occurred in Thailand. And it looks at the share of raw labour in GDP. You can think of this as a measure of what the share of labour would be in GDP, the share of wages in GDP, if all workers received the unskilled wage. The difference between that share and GDP is the payment to skill. That's a component of total wage bill, the skill component, not the raw labour component, and the payment to physical capital. And what you see is that the payment to raw labour declined from something like 38% to something like 22%, 1980 to 2007. So the economic growth that occurred in Thailand coincided with big increase in the share of national income that went to skill, to physical capital and to land. Then another angle on the same thing is the gets at the rural-urban dimension of this. It looks at agriculture. The share of agriculture in gross domestic product declines in every growing economy. That's an iron rule of economics, and it basically derives, in part at least, from the fact that we can only eat so much food. As we get richer, we spend less on food. That's one part of the story. The bottom line there is the share of agriculture in GDP. The top line is the share of agriculture in employment. I should say this is not based on actual data for Thailand. It's a kind of synthetic diagram, but the data look like this. Share of agriculture in GDP declines fast, but the share of agriculture in total employment is bigger and declines more slowly. So that means that the share of agricultural workers in GDP declines. Their share of national income falls over time relative to others. So that the outcome of all that is that in Thailand, as in some other rapidly growing economies, and China is a classic, the share of rural people in national income falls and they feel left out of the development process. They feel that they're not participating in that process. And it's easy for them to feel that urban people who are getting proportionately much more of the fruit of economic development are doing so at their expense, and that there's something very unfair about it. So the feeling that the urban elite are gaining at their expense, it's very easy to get people to think that way. And so I think that's an element of what's going on in Thailand right now. It's easy to convince people that the elite is ripping them off.
What about overall economic performance?
Yes, well, if we compare the period when Thaksin Shinawatra was in government, that was 2001 to 2006, with the period of Apisit's government, we have that comparison on the next chart. Let's focus on the blue diamond-shaped things. That's the year-on-year growth rate of real GDP at a quarterly level of observation. If you can see the year 2001 at the bottom, you see that real GDP was, under Thaksin's period, 2001 to 2006, grew quite steadily at numbers fluctuating around 5%. Now, Apisit came into government December 2008. So you have to go all the way over to the right-hand side of the diagram and look at what happened from about December 2008, and you see a plummet of the growth rate to negative about minus 7.5%, and some recovery since then. Well, the poor performance under Apisit is largely attributable to the global financial crisis. And the global financial crisis impacted on Thailand through export demand for Thailand's major export products, especially manufactured exports going to the United States and Europe. Whereas under Thaksin Shinawatra, the global economy was doing quite nicely. So if we compare economic performance under Thaksin Shinawatra with the period under Apisit, looks a lot better. Thaksin's period looks a lot better. But global economic conditions explain most of that.
Of course, in recent years, Peter, the global economic crisis has spread strife around the world, and Thailand hasn't been immune to that. You've written that the 25% contraction that was experienced by certain labour-intensive sectors of the Thai economy actually led to a huge number of layoffs. Were those laid-off people the ones who ended up manning the red shirt protests?
It doesn't have to be exactly the same individuals. People from those families, people from those villages were laid off in the labour-intensive, export-oriented industries. 2008, 2009, went back to the village looking for some way of surviving, and people back there in the village saw the absolute contraction in economic welfare that their communities were experiencing. Now, this isn't just inequality, a deterioration relative to others. This is an absolute decline in people's incomes, and huge numbers of people were involved. And again, this happened to coincide with the period of Apisit's government. So it's very easy to think, well, none of this happened under Thaksin, but under Apisit, the economy is going down the tubes, so let's blame Apisit. Very easy to draw that connection.
I'm curious about another element of political participation in Thailand. Every time there's an election in the country, there's a great deal of talk about vote buying. And of course, as you know, this is a charge which has often been levelled at former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra. It's often used to explain his corruption and all of the things that were wrong about his government. What I'm wondering is, from an economist's perspective, how do you understand vote buying?
Well, an economist thinks of this on the supply side and on the demand side. On the supply side, if you want to crack down on vote buying, you make it more costly for people to do that. And that has happened. The Election Commission has been trying to crack down on vote buying with some success, it seems. Maybe you'd know better than me about that. But then there's another side to all this that I think is even more important. The reason that there's corruption associated with elections is that it's so profitable to get into public office. Why is it so profitable? It's that when you get into office, you have the opportunity to make lots and lots of money. How come? Because the checks and balances on the way public money is spent and transparency requirements, the need for competition in government procurement, all that is insufficient. So that's an economist's perspective. It's that those aspects of public policy need to be tightened up to make it less profitable to be in public office, less lucrative. So then people are going to be less inclined to buy votes, because if you're going to buy votes, once you get into office, you have to expect that you can make a lot of money.
Finally, I know that you have raised some pretty serious concerns about the violent elements among the red shirt movement. Indeed, you have said that Thaksin is no Gandhi Aung San Suu Kyi or Dalai Lama. Of course, I agree with you. But if he's none of those, then what is he?
Well, what I was talking about in making the comparison between Thaksin and those notable people was that their movements were explicitly non-violent. And I was making the point that the red shirt movement, including the recent protests, have not been non-violent. Gandhi understood the importance of non-violence, and I think a good example of how successful it can be is the recent People's Power revolution in the Philippines. 1986, Ferdinand Marcos was kicked out of office by a mass public movement, which was non-violent. It succeeded in the end by inducing the military to refuse to obey orders. That's what defeated Ferdinand Marcos here. He ordered the tanks to advance on the demonstrators, and the soldiers refused. For that to happen, the protest has to be non-violent, and that was Gandhi's argument anyway. So I think the red shirt leadership had a chance to do something like that. Maybe. But they lost that chance by not being strictly non-violent. Now, of course, most of the violence in these recent protests came from the government side. Of course it did. They had the guns. They were far better armed than the protesters were. But there was violence coming from the red shirt side too. What is Thaksin Shinawatra? Well, Thaksin is an entrepreneur. There are three kinds of businessmen out there. There are people who have some new technology to offer. There are businessmen who are very effective managers. Finally, there are entrepreneurs. That's Thaksin Shinawatra. He's the entrepreneur par excellence. What Thaksin was able to do in his business career was to persuade various government agencies to give him special deals in procuring government equipment. He started off in the police force selling computers to the police. Subsequently, when he set up his telecommunications company, he was able to persuade the governments of the time to give him monopolistic special privileges in selling mobile phone services. He was able to get monopoly privileges by virtue of manipulating the government's capacity to regulate these industries. That was Thaksin's source of income. Now, economists are not particularly impressed by that method of generating wealth, because wealth derived from exploiting monopoly power is not adding to national income. It's becoming wealthy oneself by exploiting one's fellow citizen. Thaksin became wealthy by ripping off his fellow Thais, not by creating anything new, not by producing anything, not by being an efficient manager, but by getting monopoly privileges and exploiting them. And he realised that there was an opportunity to get even better monopolistic regulations operating in his favour by being in government himself. And the mechanism that he used to do that was to see the disaffection among the rural population of Thailand. So there's another aspect to Thailand, to Thaksin's achievements. He was politically very, very clever. He saw that rural people were disaffected, and by presenting himself as their champion, he was able to get himself elected, record majority, first time any single party was ever elected to an absolute majority in the Thai parliament. Thaksin did that.
Peter, thanks very much once again. It's been simply terrific to have you involved.
Pleasure, Nick.
Our next guest is Professor Andrew Lee, a professor in the Research School of Economics in the Australian National University's College of Business and Economics. Andrew, thanks for coming along today.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers. So, of course, you make no claim to be a Thailand expert, but you do spend a great deal of your time thinking about relevant issues like wealth, inequality and poverty, and of course population and education as well. And these are topics that are relevant to anybody who's interested in Thailand these days.
Yeah.
How would you sum up your academic interests?
Well, I think my main focus is on poverty and inequality. Most relevant to this, I think, is looking at changes in inequality at the top of the income distribution over a very long period. And so I've looked at changes in the income share of, say, the top 1% of the population. And that allows us to look over a much longer period than we would be able to look over if we were using traditional inequality measures.
In much of your research, you draw on an array of methodologies and tools, which, at least to us non-economists, are somewhat baffling. In a nutshell, can you sum up how your favourite methods work?
Well, Nick, what's interesting for this way of looking at top incomes is we're using taxation data in many cases. Tax data, the feature of tax data is that it allows us to go a really long way back. Basically, if you want a top 1% share, you can get an inequality series from tax data for all the period where the top 1% have paid tax. In the case of Australia, that takes us back to the 1920s, and interestingly, in the case of Indonesia, we're also able to go back to the 1920s using some Dutch taxation data. And it gives us this really long sweep, and so it allows us to answer questions like what happened to inequality during the Great Depression, what happened to inequality during World War II, sometimes even World War I for certain countries, and to really put things into a historical perspective that I think sometimes we miss out on when we just have a survey that covers the last 5 years. That can be cute and interesting, but it doesn't allow us to answer the sort of great questions of economic history.
Andrew, turning now to Thailand's crisis, an issue which has often generated a great deal of interest is the super wealthy in Thai society, particularly, of course, former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, a telecommunications billionaire. The economics of what's called top incomes is something that you've studied in other places, particularly in the contexts of Indonesia and Australia. Can you give us a sense of what your research can teach us about wealth in those societies?
Sure. So probably the most relevant to this is the work that I've done on Indonesia with Pierre Vandering, another colleague in the College of Business and Economics. And Pierre and I find that although Indonesia is typically regarded as quite an egalitarian country, that's actually because we measure inequality in developing countries differently from the way we measure it in developed countries. For developing countries, often we use expenditure inequality. We look at how much cash people dole out, and that gives you a sense that the distribution of inequality is not that high. The gaps aren't that big. But when you look at the inequality in incomes, the amount of money people are getting in, which takes into account not only what they spend but also what they save, then actually the gap between rich and poor looks bigger, because the poor are often borrowing and the super rich are often saving a lot. And so when you use the same type of measure of inequality, suddenly Indonesia looks as unequal as, say, the US. And that's true if you look at other metrics like sort of the ratio of the top 10 people in the country to everyone else, or even if you look at inequality within the super rich, the income share of the top 5 billionaires as a share of the top 100 billionaires. Those sort of measures are again they're worse, or they're more unequal in Indonesia than they are in a lot of developed countries. So we want to pop this myth, I think, that developing countries are particularly equal places. We've known for a long time, I think, that Latin America was pretty unequal. And I think now we should be open to the idea that maybe some Southeast Asian countries may also be pretty unequal as well.
A complementary strand of your economic research focuses on inequality. Why is inequality important to take seriously and to consider as an academic economist?
Well, I think the thing about inequality is as gaps between rich and poor get very large, you do get to a situation where it strains the social fabric, where fundamentally you have different groups of people occupying entirely different realms. The super rich begin not only opting out of public education, but also opting out of public health care, sometimes even opting out of public policing by hiring their own private security forces. You see the rise of gated estates. and that sort of means that they have a fundamentally different experience of the society. In some sense, they're then not able to empathise with the challenges that ordinary people in the society face, and dealing with traffic congestion, dealing with the quality of the public services. So I think there is a sense in which very, very large gaps strain the social fabric of a country. It's also probably the case that an extra dollar brings more happiness to a poor person than it does to a rich person. So it should be the case that as gaps get very, very large, that the happiness of a society is less than it could be if you had a more equal society. So for me, it's these kinds of fundamental, almost philosophical reasons that we should care about inequality. People also talk about instrumental reasons, impact of inequality on health, crime, growth, and so on. My own research doesn't find much support for that, so I tend to fall back more on the philosophical arguments rather than on the instrumental ones.
You often talk about using randomised trials as a way of generating interesting insights about social phenomena. For a country in crisis, are there any particularly interesting ways that such tools can be used?
Well, randomised trials have really taken off in development economics, largely through organisations such as the JPAL Poverty Action Lab in MIT, or its counterparts in Yale, Institute Innovations in Poverty Action. These organisations have been instrumental in setting up randomised trials, effectively to test new policies in the way we test new pharmaceuticals. You want to get a new drug for flu approved in Australia, typically you need to run a randomised trial in which participants come in, you toss a coin, half of them get a placebo, half get the real drug, and then you see what happens as a result of taking the drug. And increasingly that methodology is being taken up in development economics to test the efficacy of new interventions. So would students do better if we paid the teachers more, or if we reduced the class size? You can answer a question like that either with a randomised trial, I think, in a way that is more rigorous than were you to try and answer it using theory alone.
More generally, I'm wondering if you could finally perhaps talk about the kinds of methods that you would bring to bear if you were going to be studying Thailand over the next few years. Many out there in our Thailand in Crisis audience are looking for novel ways of trying to understand the very complicated social, political and economic dynamics that we're seeing playing out in Thailand. Are there any approaches to understanding a society at such a critical juncture that you would find especially enticing?
So I'm a big randomister. I think my strong belief is that randomised trials can be employed in a host of different settings and really to learn a lot more about questions that haven't previously been answered well. With Dean Carlin, I've been working on a project in the Philippines, which is trying to look at the impact of financial literacy training as a way of helping small entrepreneurs. And we're actually doing a double randomisation technique there, where we're looking not only at the impact of financial literacy, but also at the impact of helping small entrepreneurs break the debt cycle, say by giving them about $50 US. We look at the impact of one of those interventions, the other one on its own, and then both together. And so we're really able to sort of push the envelope in a way that I think is particularly rigorous and I think has a great future. This is much less about kind of grand visions and much more about the idea that we ought to be modest about what we know and really rigorously look at the impact of individual interventions. Much as, for example, we try and come up with a cure for cancer. Piece by piece, rigorously working out what works, what doesn't, throwing away the flotsam and trying to go on with the stuff that works.
Andrew, thanks very much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to have you involved.
Likewise.
Finally, I'm joined once again by Andrew Walker. Andrew, what do you have planned for us today?
Today, Nick, I've got a couple of terrific graphs that I'm sure our viewers are going to enjoy very much indeed.
Let's have a look.
Well, my two graphs today, Nick, are about agricultural credit. That's money provided by banks, private banks, and in particular the Bank of Agriculture and Cooperatives for agricultural operations in Thailand. And I'm looking at this because it's part of this broader issue of the level of government support that's provided for the agricultural sector. Last week I showed some graphs about the direct government budget for agriculture. Today I'm looking at some more indirect initiatives in relation to agricultural credit. And this first graph shows the increase in credit provision since the 1960s. And it shows that credit provision from two sources. First of all, from private banks, and also from the government-run Bank of Agriculture and Cooperatives. And as in the previous graphs, the big picture here is pretty stark. We've seen a dramatic increase in agricultural credit since the 1960s. And once again, I've adjusted these figures for inflation. And we can see back in the 1960s there was $5 billion or so worth of agricultural credit provided, and this has exploded in the decades since to reach up to 500 or 600 billion worth of agricultural credit. Now, if we look at the specifics of those two lines on the graph, we see something very interesting indeed. We can see that earlier on, the significant amount of credit came from private banks, and this peaked in the mid-1990s, but then in the financial crisis and in the wake of the financial crisis dropped off, and it hasn't really recovered since. And what has really grown to take the place of that private credit is credit provided through the government's bank, through the Bank of Agriculture and Cooperatives. And this underlines the general point I've made before about the significance of government support for the agricultural sector, and it also adds a bit of nuance to the point I made last week about Thaksin's relatively lacklustre performance in relation to the agricultural budget, the Thai government provided budget. Here we can see that Thaksin's performance in relation to credit provision was pretty healthy over the years of the Thaksin government, except towards the end there was pretty significant growth in credit provision. But once again, it's important to remember that this certainly wasn't unprecedented. We've seen rapid growth over a much longer period than just Thaksin's term in government. Now, if we turn to the second graph, we see the broad picture is much the same. We can see that growth and the relative distribution between government-funded credit and credit through private banks. But here I've expressed the amounts as a percentage of agricultural GDP. And you can see that back in the 60s, credit amounted to 3 or 4 or 5% of agricultural GDP, and this too has increased dramatically to the present, where it makes up 50 or 60% of agricultural GDP. Now, why is this important? It shows that credit provision has played a very important role in allowing farmers to expand and upgrade their level of production and make that agricultural production much more productive, generate a lot more income for them. So credit provision has played a key role in economic growth and poverty reduction in the agricultural sector. But there's also another issue that I think it points to, and a much more explicitly political issue, and that is that government policy matters to farmers. When you have agricultural credit making up 50% or so of agricultural GDP, obviously it's a very important issue in people's livelihoods. Now, there's been a lot of discussion in the press and on our own website on New Mandala lately about the issue of vote buying. And a lot of people like to think that political parties in Thailand go out and hand out 100 baht or 500 baht or a bottle of whiskey, and that secures people's votes. Well, in some cases it might. But what these figures show is that there are much bigger financial issues in play for farmers. Yes, 500 baht might be nice, a bottle of whiskey might be nice, but much more important is having secure access to this government-supported credit through the Bank of Agriculture and Cooperatives. Much more important is the level of funding we saw last week that's provided through the agricultural budget. So I think if we look at some of the graphs I've shown lately, I'm trying to paint a picture that government policy matters for farmers, and that's why they get involved in the political process, to write off their political involvement as just a simple matter of 100 baht or 500 baht here and there is a gross misunderstanding of what's going on in Thailand.
Thanks, Andrew. That was fascinating as always. But I've really got to ask, what's an anthropologist doing being interested in economics anyway?
Well, I'm glad you've asked that, Nick, because on New Mandala there's been some questioning of my economic credentials, and I'd like to put the record straight. I studied economics in first year at Sydney University in 1979, and I got a credit. So I'd like to have that on the record and put those comments to rest.
Duly noted.
Okay, now, why is an anthropologist interested in economics? Well, there's a long tradition of economic anthropology. Anthropologists are interested in the way people make a living, and economics is fundamental to that. Specifically for my research, I find looking at some of these national economic trends very useful for two reasons. It helps me put the very specific and very fine-grained village level information I get in a broader context. Sometimes, to be frank, as an anthropologist, you lose sight of the big picture because you're very involved in the day-to-day micro-politics and microeconomics of village life, and it's good to get that bigger picture. I also think it's important because statistics can help us get a historical perspective. And I think that's very important in Thailand's current political crisis because so many things are attributed to specific policy actions or specific initiatives on the part of the Thaksin government or subsequent governments. And I think by looking at some of these longer term series of economic data, we can get a much clearer perspective on what's new and, perhaps more importantly, what's not new at all.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks as ever for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks very much for joining us again. Next week, in the last episode of the Thailand in Crisis vodcast and podcast series, we're going to have a bit of a change of scenery. We're going to be moving out of this broom-covered studio and going upstairs to something that's a bit more spacious and gives us a bit more room to move. I'll be joined by a number of very special guests who'll be talking with me about Thailand's future, the future for their country. Thank you very much for joining us for this episode of the series. I look forward to seeing you next week. Best wishes to all. Three very special guests, outstanding young Thai scholars who've been doing their doctoral studies here in the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific. Natakan Akra Pongpisak, Pongpisuk Buzbarat and Priti Hongsatorn. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you here. And of course, Sawadee krap. Okay, thanks guys. So my first question really comes back to the genesis of this Thailand in Crisis vodcast and podcast series. I'm interested to hear your reactions to the events of April and May 2010.
You know what, Nick? I come to think about this question. I find it very hard to answer because I don't really know how to start with thinking about the situation back then. It was hard to actually know what's going on back in Thailand at the time. My friends kept asking me, what's going on, what's happening in Thailand? And I couldn't answer them because I didn't really know what's going on. The internet websites got blocked and I don't really know what's going on. The only thing I could do is just to call back home and to tell my relatives, my parents, to stay safe and not going out of the house at night and things like that. So the only thing I can say is I'm sad with the situation. But putting the emotion aside, I think it reflects the political conflict that has been going on since the 2006 coup and even before that. And I think it's one of the series and I think it will go on.
Yeah, I agree with him. My first reaction was pretty much similar to what he had. I think, it's sad simply to put it, but it's not unexpected. We all, Thai ANU students, we came together and discussed about political conflict many times during the course of conflict in Bangkok, and we expected something to happen. Learning from history, because we are all history students, political science students. Back to history, it happened, and that's probably the norm of the state to respond to this kind of resistance. But we didn't really think that it's going to be this bad. So it's very sad.
Well, for me, I agree with him that it is not beyond expectation, because prior to that point, the government suggests a plan for an early election in November, a dissolution of parliament in October, and the protesters demanded for an investigation of the previous bloodshed events, and no agreement was reached. So the tension's always there, and so it's not beyond expectation for me. But I think it was very sad, distressing moment to say that. But the saddest thing is we still don't know whether we are gonna know what exactly happened on those days. Why did those people, including the life-saving volunteers, protesters, rank and file soldiers, were killed that day? Who killed them? Well, I still hope that we will see an investigation, a serious investigation of the incidents by a committee whose legitimacy is approved by both sides.
What do you make of the arguments that inequality is a major driver of Thailand's recent political strife?
Well, I think it's not. Well, if you want to see the factor that engender these confrontations on the street between the red and yellow, it is not inequality in terms of income or absolute poverty itself that I think drove the political strife in Thailand. Well, there have been a lot of researches, interesting researches recently, showing that, including the recent research from the Faculty of Economics of Thammasat University, showing that in some villages, I talk about the village again, in some villages in Thailand, you can see that the poorest households are yellow supporters. And in the neighborhood of the village that I'm conducting a research in northern Thailand, well, actually, some red shirts are richer than the yellow shirts. So it's kind of it's very hard to say that it is income inequality that caused this kind of confrontations between the two sides. But let me put it this way: I think from my interviews, it is kind of the inequality of an access to resources for upward mobility, or the people's perception of political inequality that drove the people to come to Bangkok and protest.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, and I think it's reflected in many of your guests, in previous episodes of Thailand in Crisis, especially Andrew mentioned about relative poverty, relative or unfair opportunity to access to resources, and I think that sense of injustice kind of helped them relate to what was going on at the national level when they see, Thaksin or his colleague, treated, unfairly in the court, in political system, in any area. They can relate. That help bring perception that Thailand is unequal, and they can use their own individual experience to kind of build up that political awareness, and probably that's part of the reason why a lot of people from rural areas just came into Bangkok and participated in these protests.
I just have to just a bit of comment on that. Only just that Thailand is not an equal society to start with, and but the structural analysis of seeing the inequality of the economic and of course the relative poverty would cause one way or another to the political conflict at the moment, or not. Is it the case or not, and so on and so forth. This kind of analysis would have to be taken into account that if inequality is always there, why this particular conflict emerged at this moment of time, of history. Why is this particular conflict, the movement, and so on and so forth, took place at this moment. And I think this complements each other, and not both. They're not right and wrong, but I think it should be both taken into consideration.
Turning now to the divisive figure of former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, what do you make of his role in the recent protests? Do you consider him a terrorist?
Well, you know, we cannot deny the fact that the ex-Prime Minister Thaksin has kind of huge influences on the red shirt movement. Well, even the red shirt movement, when they give interview to the media in Thailand, foreign media, they say that they come to protest in Bangkok because they say what the government, the opposite government or the judicial mechanism treat Mr. Thaksin is unfair. Well, but you know, I think after many incidents occur since last year, like the court verdicts against the ex-PM Samak or the disbandment of the People's Power Party, and the way that the opposite government came into power, like through the competition in the parliament, not through the direct election. I think from that point, the protesters tried to detach themselves from the ex-prime minister and more like question about the political and judicial mechanism in Thailand. So actually, in this point, I think it is now beyond Mr. Thaksin, about the movement.
Yeah, I agree, and you know, reflect back to the previous question too, because Thaksin becomes at least a moral figure for the protester in the beginning, and as I said, a lot of people can relate injustice that he was treated or he was received during the political crisis back in 2006, 2007, and so on. And that kind of represent their feeling of injustice happening in the country. And even though later on, during the course of protest, a lot of people trying to detach themselves from Thaksin, but we can't deny that actually he plays certain roles. Well, at least, you know, in like what I said, in moral support, in to great extent probably financial support and tactic support. We well, as a student, and we don't really have much information about that, but he has some roles, very important too.
Yeah, so it's the same. I don't really know what's he doing. But did he give money to the protest? How much did he give? How many phone calls that he did he do to the protest leaders and so on and so forth? But the thing is that he has become a figure, a symbol. And no matter how hard you want to take him away, he's not going to go away. And the governments and as well as I think the group, how do you call it, to try to put Thaksin out of the picture, the more they try to put him out, to sort of throw him away from that sort of political picture, the more that he will become central to the political conflict. And I suppose the government needs to reassess the question and the problems in order to solve this political conflict at the moment.
Is he a terrorist?
Well, it's hard to say.
I think it's sort of legal, you know, area where or how you interpret the law.
Because we don't really know what's going on, so it's so hard to.
Well,
yeah. But let me say that even the yellow shirt supporters in rural village, they say that, well, probably.
Yeah. I mean, like, probably you have to use your intuition.
Yeah.
Like the picture of terrorist. What is terrorist should be like.
Yeah.
I don't think Mr. Thaksin fits into that picture. But
well, ask some villagers and they say that, oh, do you mean someone like Bin Laden?
Yeah, true. So I think it's a legal manipulation somehow, interpretation, I would put it that way. And we might see how this interpretation, you know, kind of play around when the Thai government send a arrest warrant to Interpol or other foreign governments under extradition treaties. So we can see how terrorism or terrorist definition would work out more, or if definition under the Thai government or Thai law would fit internationally.
There was a sense among many foreign observers that if an election was to be called, say, this year, that Thaksin-aligned politicians would probably end up winning. Do you think that that's still the case?
That's a very interesting question indeed. Well, it is very hard to say right now what's going to happen. I mean, who's going to win the election? I can't tell exactly right now, but let me say this. In Bangkok, I think we need to keep a close look on what's going to happen on the 25th of this month, which is the upcoming election by-election of the constituency number 6 in Bangkok. And well, the interesting thing is if the Democrat, which seems to have a strong support in Bangkok, lose the seat, we can see some possible scenarios, I think. But in other provinces, I think we can expect a lot of surprises. If you still remember, in the by-election in January, you know, one of the Lamphun MP, Kun Khayan, Viprom Lak or Viprom Chai something, he won the seat. And at that time, you know, Lamphun is labeled the red area, and he's from the Democrat Party. So I think the surprise like this will emerge during the election. And you know, when we look at the election, people may think that rural villages, when they vote, it's kind of like an order from the boss network or influence of political canvassers or vote buying, something like that. But actually, when those people think about how they're gonna vote, they think about the policies that the political parties want to push for them, and their favor about the political parties, and including political sentiment. I think, well, we cannot deny the fact that the opposite government, well, some villagers benefit from opposite government. For example, the people who participated in Thailand's land reform network, and the elderly who got allowances from the program that is initiated by this government. And on the other hand, could we expect the people who participated in the Red Shirt movement in Bangkok to forget about the things that happened in May and April 2010? So it's kind of like we have a lot of factors to criticize, to analyze before we can say who exactly is going to win. And one interesting factor that I think we need to look at too is, well, you know, we cannot tell exactly right now how the Pheu Thai party is going to position itself with Mr. Thaksin on the red shirt protest prior to the election. That remains a question.
Yeah, I think, well, similar. And again, reflecting in Andrew's first episode too, political support in Thailand is fluid. It's not like static, and you can't really, say that the northeast will forever support Thaksin and his friends and parties. But then, like, considering what Natagan was saying, we now see a lot of measures from, especially budgetary measures from the opposite government recently toward supporting the lower income group, in the country. With a lot of policy. And recently, I think a couple of days ago, I think yesterday, I was reading newspaper. Mr. Gon Jatikabanik, he was proposing to lift a collection of fee in electricity, bus and train for the low income group. And I think these kind of measures coming up, more frequently toward, if we have another election soon. And I think that's somehow is going to affect sort of vote in many areas. And I think, like what she said, we can kind of gauge in the next Bangkok election, the by-election, to see if Bangkok people, that could be represent how Bangkokians think about current government and the opposition. And I think we're going to see something interesting.
Well, PP just mentioned about all the factors that should be taken into account about this election. But I just want to take a step back to look at the bigger picture of the political conflict in a larger scale. Since the coup in 2006 and even before that, I think there were attempts to trying to bring politics in and out of the parliament, one time or another. One time they tried to bring it in, whether it can solve the problem or not, and then it was brought out again and in and out, and so on and so forth. But I'm still worried that this time that they're trying to bring political conflicts into the parliament again, whether it's going to work or not, because it was shown that it's not working a few years ago, and then they were trying to so this political conflict was solved outside the parliament and in the streets and so on and so forth. But at this time the election will be called, and it's the sign that the political conflict will be brought back to be solved in the parliament again. And we saw that there is something that needed to be changed before the politics can be solved within the parliament. And I think that's an important thing to think about, whether what the election result will come out.
Yeah, but I think strategically, it's a matter of when the election is going to be held.
Yeah, according to the government,
Yeah.
probably early next year.
Oh,
They postpone it again.
we never know. It might not happen at all.
Do the current political problems make you want to change your immediate career objectives and plans? Indeed, are any of you thinking about going home to Thailand and maybe going back to play politics?
Well, if you mean being a politician, no. but you know, if you mean politics in general sense, well, all of us know that we all are engaged in politics since we were born, no matter whether we realize it or not, right?
Yeah, especially if you are aiming for academic career, and of course she's going to be in political science department, he's going to be like the history sort of area. We ended up, it's going to end up talking politics anyway. So in that sense, we engage, frequently
Yes.
or regularly in politics. But what I'm afraid now, if I go back to Thailand at the moment, I think the freedom of speech is going to be trimmed, and that's what academics is looking for, like freedom of speech. If you're right and have been taken away, it's not comfortable to talk, or engage in a serious, rational and logical way of conversation.
I don't have the intention to play politics, of course. Politicians in the podium and so on. I don't have money to start with, so I can't be a politician. Well, one way or another, we have to, to involve in politics, and especially being academics, as Pompous said. But there's one thing I think I see Thai politics at the moment is that Thai politics, I mean, in terms of the parliament, the form of the parliamentary, in the parliament, as a part, it has excluded, or it has become a place where only a professional politician can play a part in. If you know what I mean. I mean, if you are
if you're not born in the family,
if you're not born in the family, or if you're not,
that like technocrats or bureaucrats like take political position.
But right now you have to be really. I don't know if English word can be a professional politician, but in Thai, นักการเมืองอาชีพ it's the word that. So it's a place for these I don't want to say these kind of people, these people to do their jobs and exclude other people. So That's why it's hard for me to think of any group of think tank in the government at the moment, in terms of not in terms of preventing their to keeping their power, but in terms of how to develop this country into sort of a how to develop economically, politically, and culturally. So it's a bit harder to find this think tank, a group of people, a group of academics, of professionals, this group of people that do the job. And also, back to me. Let us imagine of a tree. There's a tree, and we cannot think that the tree will, the big tree that will prevent us from the UV, from the sunshine, and everything. But we cannot think that the tree will always do that job. We have to water it, from time to time. We have to water it so the tree can grow. But we cannot just stay and think that the tree will help us and prevent us, and we don't have to do anything. So this applies to this political situation at the moment.
Finally, I'm curious about the future. What do you think the future will bring for Thailand? Are any of you optimistic?
I'm quite an optimist, actually. I still think that with crisis comes opportunity. And well, if you think of it this way, there was never once before the confrontations between the red and the yellow shirts happened since like 4 years ago, right? That people talk about the issue like the distribution of public and development resources, talk about social stratification, talks about life chances, talks about political legitimacy. Well, it has not been flourished to this extent. So I think that's a good sign. Yeah. So I still think that, well, except the fact that, well, I know that people can still talk, can still like engage more into politics, but just one thing that I'm concerned about is, well, I do not mind about the conflict itself, but how the conflicts led to casualty and deaths of both sides. That's what I'm concerned about, but not about the conflict itself.
That's why I let you answer first.
Because I'm quite optimistic.
I'm quite pessimistic about them.
Okay.
Well, let me put it this way. Probably I'm a bit optimistic in the long term, in the longer term. But in the medium term, I tend to be pessimistic about the situation. We are not certain yet, whether or not Thailand is going to turn to sort of authoritarian regime, like Ajahn Thongchai mentioned, like Marcos, kind of resemble to that regime. And whether election is going to be held at all in the end, and if not, or if it happens, what kind of political situation or system is going to turn out to be?
But many societies in the world have undergone this process.
Yeah, but if somehow when we discuss about this kind of thing, it can't be totally like objective, about the thing, because it's involved a lot of emotion and what we expect the system or the country to be. So it somehow is normative in many sense. So we expect a full democracy. We prefer that. We have to answer our questions first, like if we really prefer democracy, and if we want that democracy, so what if it's not in the future? What is going to be? I mean, like, how it's going to affect, people in, many areas, especially in the rural area. Of course, as many scholars have discussed about, whether or not it's democratic in the country, the middle class will not be affected anyway, because, they are in the center of power and economy. So I think if Thailand turned to be undemocratic or, go backward to sort of authoritarian, it's going to affect a lot of people. And even though we have election and we have like democratic election in the next years, but then it depends on the elite if they're going to accept that result, if it's not going to turn out to their advantage or interest. So, and the second point is not only elite preference of how political system is going to be shaped in the future. But now it comes to people. So if the result turn out to be, against red shirt group, against the yellow group, so what's going to happen to Thailand in the next probably 5 years? Are we going to turn back to the same conflict? Well, it's okay to have conflict, but then to that extent, to that kind of violence, are we going to experience that again in the next couple of years from now? And and I don't know, the other issues I think is very important, but less likely to discuss in the public. The succession issue. Well, I won't touch upon that into great detail. Dan Thong Chai has done a great job on that, and many people have done that. Yeah, there's a lot of instability and uncertainties happening around. So probably in the long term, people are going to learn and absorb that kind of, or adjust themselves to accept the fact that thing is going to change, and you have to play by rule. And if we really aim for full democracy, we have to be more tolerant.
Well, we got the optimistic and we got the pessimistic, so I'm going to be a little bit...
I think I'm in the middle.
I should be pessimistic.
Yeah.
Well, I just have this short observation about this this process of reconciliation, Prong Dong.
Yeah, that's another.
And, well, as you see, Prong Dong, in what terms, in what meanings, and as I say at the moment, the process of I call it Prong Dong then. I think reconciliation is... Prong Dong itself means, to me, Prong Dong is to think the same, to think differently, to think the same, without different opinions. And I think that an attempt to try to homogenize the opinions is very dangerous. It's very dangerous indeed, because we are in the position, and everything in a society at the moment is very polarized. But as we all said before this, is that how do we make the mechanism of tolerance to work in this country? And if this Kabun Gan Prong Dong, the reconciliation process, work in this way of trying to bring in harmony by thinking that people should think in the same way, and there are other issues that we couldn't talk about today, institutions and so on and so forth. But that's why we have to start building this sort of mechanism, and rerun it. I don't know whether it has been run before, but have to run it in order for us, three of us, to talk to you today in many things, and in order to make the wider general audience to talk about everything that needs to be talked very, very urgently, because the later the things that we cannot talk about will be talked, the more the risk will be of the transitional period of Thailand. And I think this, I come back to this Kabun Gan Prong Dong, which I think you have to reassess.
Yeah, that's what I have, kind of pessimistic view in the medium term, because currently the government, even though they kind of push Kabun Gan Prong Dong reconciliation process, but it seems to me it's kind of hypocrite, sort of, you want to Prong Dong, you want to reconciliate among different people, different groups, but then at the same time, a lot of authorities, playing another games, like demonize, the other opposition group,
block websites,
call
people in without,
and trying to build some. Well, back to the very first question, trying to manipulate some history or what people should believe, and I don't think that reconciliation process is sustainable enough to bring Thailand out of crisis.
Natakan, Pongpisut and Priti, it's been simply wonderful to have you involved today. It's been a real pleasure to hear your opinions and perspectives, and I can say without any hesitation that this has been a highlight for me. So thank you all very much. Sawadee ka. I'm joined today once again by Dr. Andrew Walker, Senior Fellow in the Department of Political and Social Change in the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific. Andrew, it's great that you can join us again.
It's a pleasure, Nick.
So when we started this Thailand in Crisis vodcast and podcast series about 6 weeks ago, back in May 2010, the violence on the streets of Bangkok was still very raw and the political crisis was still a very real thing. What kind of lessons have we learned since then?
Well, there's obviously been lots of lessons, but for me, I think the most important lesson is just how slow the Thai government is in learning lessons. I really wonder what it's going to take for them to really come to appreciate the sentiments, the desire for inclusion that those red shirt protests reflected. We've entered into a process now that they're calling reconciliation, but it really seems to be a process of reconciliation by fiat that's coupled with all sorts of repression of the red shirt movement. There doesn't seem to be any genuine commitment to a more open, a more democratic political space emerging in Thailand. This is a public relations exercise in reconciliation that's serving the political interests of the government. So I come back to my original point. What's it going to take for them to accept that this desire for inclusion is going to come out one way or another in Thai society? They've rejected people when people have gone peacefully to the ballot box and expressed their desire for inclusion in that way. When people came to Bangkok to protest, they won't accept that. They'll dismiss all this type of political action as just the hire a crowd mentality that it's been paid for by Thaksin or whatever. They simply won't accept that there are genuine political sentiments there, and I don't know what it's going to take to make them accept that.
Do you have a graph for us this day, Andrew? Something that perhaps gives us more of a sense of your thinking on what's about to happen in the country?
Well, of course, Nick, I do have another graph, and today it's a different type of graph, and it's referring to the upcoming by-election in Bangkok, in constituency 6 of Bangkok, that's been caused by the death of one of the Democrat members for that constituency. And I think this election speaks exactly to the issues that I've been talking about. And that is, as some of our previous guests said, this is going to be a very important test of the government's reconciliation program. As you can see from the graph, it sets out the results of the election in 2007. And there were 3 members elected from that constituency, 2 from the Democrats and 1 from PPP. And I've also provided the results for the next 3 people in terms of order of votes achieved in that election, and there were some others, but they had much less votes than those. And you can see the picture is the election in that particular constituency was pretty close.
Indeed, it looks very close, doesn't it? With not too many votes between these top 6 candidates at all?
No, it's only a matter of 10,000 votes or so between these top 6 candidates. And the government's going to have a real fight on its hands here, and the person that's standing for the Pheu Thai party, as we know, is one of the UDD leaders, one of the red shirt leaders, who in the government's eyes is an accused terrorist. So if they can't win an election against an imprisoned and accused terrorist, they can't really win an election against anybody. So if this election doesn't go well for the government, if they don't win very solidly in this by-election, it's really going to very publicly call into question the credibility, the political credibility of their so-called reconciliation program.
Thanks, Andrew. A fascinating point to end this particular conversation, and really to wrap up the Thailand in Crisis series as a whole. It's been terrific as ever to have your contributions.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Andrew. That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining in this 6th and final episode of the Thailand in Crisis vodcast and podcast series, brought to you from the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific in Canberra. We've really enjoyed this opportunity to share with you our perspectives on Thailand's recent period of political strife. As ever, if you'd like to join in the conversation, you can do so at the New Mandala website, or you can leave comments for us at the Australian National University's YouTube channel. I'd like to especially thank Martin Pearce and Darren Boyd, who have been the production team behind the success of this recent series. I really can't thank them enough. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to all of the guests who've joined in making this series such a pleasure to watch and listen to. Later in the year, we plan to be back with some further vodcast and podcast series. We hope that you'll take the time to tune in then. In the meantime, all I can say is best wishes to all.